Game of Thrones, The Wrath of the Sleeping Dragon. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 26. The crisis is coming. Standing on a stool, the boy leaned on the windowsill, facing the salty and humid sea breeze, breathing the faint smell of burnt and blood in the air, and the silver gold curly hair gently caressed his white forehead. Tonight is destined to be a sleepless night. The bells in the distance have stopped, but the boy's inner boredom has not disappeared at all. He hates this feeling, leaving his fate to others, because this naval battle directly determines his life and death. If the Dragonston fleet is defeated, he, his mother, and Rhaenys will not be able to escape, no matter where they hide. After all, Dragonston is so big. The sea is like a cage that imprisons them here, and there is no room for escape. Viserys decided to wait until this matter is over. If the Dragonston fleet can repel the invading enemy, then he will do something to change his current situation. For example, persuade his mother to give up Dragonston and lead the fleet to escape to the East Continent. However, Viserys also knew that it would be extremely difficult to do this. After all, Dragonston is of great significance to the Targaryen family. Although he had been crowned as Viserys Targaryen III, he was still young, and even the so-called king was just a title, and even the guards at the door would not take it seriously. A king who was only 7 years old and had lost his throne and fled all the way had no power at all. Even commanding a servant required his mother's approval. On the entire Dragonston Island, in addition to the fleet commander, Queen Rhaenyra's words were decisive. While Viserys was thinking about it, he suddenly seemed to think of something. Since the attack by the Lannister family on the way to escape half a year ago, Rhaenys had the habit of having nightmares in the middle of the night. The little girl was often awakened by nightmares in the middle of the night, and then she cried and ran to Viserys' room for comfort. The two children's rooms were very close, and Rhaenys' bedroom was next to Viserys, and only by holding her brother who was a few years older than her could the brown-haired little girl fall asleep again. In fact, both of them were miserable people, and Rhaenys had lost her parents. Tonight, there were many things going on. First, the old Maester died of illness and took his last breath. Then, there was an attack from a fleet that came from nowhere. Viserys was full of random thoughts and forgot about Rhaenys for a while. According to the past, the bell outside had spread throughout the entire Dragonston Island, and Rhaenys should have been awakened long ago. However, there was no movement in Rhaenys' bedroom until now. Not awake yet? Viserys tilted his head slightly, leaned out of the castle by the windowsill, and looked at Rhaenys' bedroom next to him. Under him was a cliff tens of meters deep, and the waves kept rushing forward and then hit the broken rocks below the castle. Viserys became much braver, so he didn't worry about accidentally falling down when he leaned out like this. However, after leaning out his head and looking at the window next to him, Rhaenys' bedroom was dark without any light. It looks like he really hasn't woken up yet. That's really strange. The silver gold hair fluttered. The boy blinked his eyes and thought for a moment, then retracted his body. He picked up the short sword on the windowsill, jumped down from the small stool, and then walked quickly towards the bedroom door. Creaky, Viserys opened the door of his bedroom. And there were indeed two fully armed guards standing outside the door, wearing ringmail shirts and long swords on their waists. Viserys wanted to go out, but was stopped by the two guards. "Your Highness." The two guards looked at the little king with a wry smile on their faces. Although he had been crowned king, Viserys himself did not take it seriously. The guards did not even change their words and still called Viserys "Your Highness." And now I didn't expect that Sir William was right. His Highness was not willing to hide in the house, and would definitely find something to do. However, this time they were wrong. Viserys spread his hands slightly, a little helpless, and then pointed to Rhaenys' room next door and said, "I'm just going to find Rhaenys. Of course I won't run around." The silver-haired boy's reasons were naturally sufficient. After all, the good relationship between the two children was a fact that everyone in the entire castle could see. Rhaenys always liked to pester Viserys. Even when he was practicing swords, Rhaenys was willing to sit under the shade of the tree beside him to accompany him. Moreover, Weenus always made slips of the tongue and called Viserys brother. After being educated by Queen Leda several times, she reluctantly changed to uncle, but the little girl's face was still full of reluctance. Indeed, for a child, there was no more complicated reason, and it would not involve the thoughts of adults. In her simple view, Viserys was not much older than her, and the two were of the same age. But he was a generation older than her for no reason, and she felt a little unwilling, so she deliberately called Viserys brother. But Viserys didn't care about these. Since you are looking for Her Royal Highness the Princess. The two guards looked at each other, hesitated slightly and nodded. After all, Weenie's bedroom was next door, and the little king did not run around. If they did not even agree to this request, it would be a bit too inhumane. Well, then. The metal friction of the armor made a sound. Then the two guards held the hilt of the sword with one hand, nodded, and made way. Thank you. And Viserys also nodded, and then suddenly thought of something when he walked past them. We stopped in front of Rhaenys' door. At this moment, Viserys' figure could not be seen directly from the corner. Then the boy raised his head and asked casually, "Then are there guards protecting Mother? After all, too many things happened tonight, and there was a naval battle going on outside. If the Dragonstone fleet was defeated, none of them would be able to escape." However, Viserys thought of another thing. If the Dragonstone fleet was fully mobilized to fight the enemy, wouldn't it mean that the coastline of Dragonstone was completely undefended at this time? Any small boat can be rowed to the shore and land silently in the night. Dragonstone is poor and has only a small fishing village. As the Lord of Dragonstone, it is almost impossible to summon soldiers for combat. The only defense force on the entire island is the dozens of guards in the castle. However, the castle is extremely huge, and these guards can't do everything. After hearing the words of the little king, the two guards were stunned. They didn't think as much as Viserys, but they nodded with certainty. Of course. Her Majesty the Queen is also protected by guards. However, while the three were talking, bang, suddenly there was a sound of a bowstring bursting, and a crossbow arrow flew out in the darkness. Chapter 27, Chasing. Puff, the crossbow arrow shot out from the darkness penetrated the throat of a guard without any hindrance. The sharp point came out from the back of the guard's neck, flashing cold light, and blood splattered on the wall. The guard's eyes widened, as if he had never expected death to come so suddenly. He wanted to say something, but his trachea was filled with blood and he could only make an inexplicable sound. He stretched out his hand to pull out the crossbow arrow stuck in his neck, but in the end he lost all his strength before he touched the crossbow arrow. Plop, the corpse's knees softened and fell to the ground. Viserys was standing not far from the guard. Because of the perspective, his position could not be directly seen from the corner. However, in fact, he was very close to the killed guard, and he was even talking to him just now, and the guard still had a smile on his face. But in a flash, the hot blood splashed on the clean face of the silver-haired boy. All this happened so fast, and so unexpectedly, that Viserys and the other guard didn't react at all. They just stood there stupidly, as if they were stunned. However, the only remaining guard reacted faster than Viserys. He seemed to see a pair of crow eyes in the darkness. Enemy attack. Then the guard suddenly drew his sword from his waist and pulled Viserys, who had just reacted and wiped the blood off his face, back with one hand. "Your Highness, run." The young guard stood in front of Viserys to cover the little king, and the silver-haired boy with blood on his face did not hesitate or refuse. He turned around and ran. Bang, in the darkness, the taut bowstring burst out again. Another crossbow arrow flew out from the darkness, and this time its target was Viserys, who finally appeared in his sight. Unfortunately, Viserys ran so fast that the crossbow arrow missed the target. The difficulty of moving targets is much higher than that of fixed targets. The crossbow arrow caught the boy's hair and took away a strand of his silver gold hair, then nailed it hard into the wall. Bang, gravel and dust flew up, and the tail of the crossbow arrow was still trembling slightly, showing how powerful the arrow was. That was close. Viserys first felt a slight chill in his ears, followed by a burning pain. However, at this moment, Viserys had no time to care about the pain on his face. His heart was beating faster and faster, and he was extremely panicked. He just wanted to escape as soon as possible. Damn it. It's screwed. In the darkness not far away, The mercenary group members who attacked with crossbows saw that the second arrow did not succeed and let the Targaryen boy escape, and their faces were slightly gloomy. However, what was worse was that the shouting of the guard seemed to have alarmed the guards of the entire stone drum tower. If they were exposed first, it might even affect the plan of the leader and several other brothers on the other side to kill Queen Leela. Chase. The big man named Langdon, who was carrying a battle axe, also had a gloomy face, and his red and black paint looked quite ferocious. Then he suddenly stood up from the darkness and strode in the direction of Viserys. The 7 people who were carrying out this commission were all good players in the group. After all, this commission was very important, and the people they brought with them had to be few and elite. Otherwise, if they were discovered by the fleet of Dragonstone, even if they pulled all the people in their mercenary group over in the sea, they would all jump into the sea to feed the fish. After entering the Dragonstone castle, the 7 people split into 2 groups. One group of 3 people came to kill Viserys, and the other group, led by the leader, led the remaining 3 people to attack Queen Leela, who had more adequate defenses. They thought that sending 3 people to kill a child was more than enough, and the main purpose was to deal with Prince Targaryen's guards. Langdon strode in pursuit of Viserys, but the loyal Dragonstone guard would not let them go so easily. Stop. The guard held a shield in one hand and a long sword in the other, blocking the corridor in their way. Although his voice was loud and resounding, a slight tremor could still be heard. Who are you? However, he still did not turn around and run away. He tried his best to buy time for Viserys to escape. Dragonstone was once the fief of Rhaegar Targaryen, so these guards were all subordinates who had followed Prince Rhaegar and were loyal to the Targaryen family. Viserys didn't know how his almost perfect brother could be so friendly that everyone who had seen him praised him. But in his memory, his elder brother was indeed very talented and handsome. He remembered that his brother once took the boy to the royal forest for a picnic, but they were attacked by an adult wild boar. Prince Rhaegar held Viserys and used only one hand and a sword to skillfully and elegantly knock down the wild boar. But Rhaegar did not chase it and kill it, but let the injured wild boar escape. In short, the deceased prince has become a synonym for perfection. And now the loyal guards of Dragonstone did not run away, but bravely met him, delaying Viserys' escape time. Clang. The guards who had undergone rigorous training and had good skills fought head on with the mercenaries, who usually fought hard, and 3 of them surrounded him alone in a narrow corridor. Clang clang. The guards' long swords blocked the attacks of the other 2, and in the darkness, sparks flew from the collision of metal and iron. However, a battle axe chopped down immediately, and the Targaryen soldiers could only raise the round shield in their left hands to resist in a hurry. The next second, bang, wood chips flew, and the big man among the mercenaries held the battle axe and chopped it hard on the round shield held in the guard's left hand with great force and almost split the shield in half with one axe. The guards of Dragonstone did not expect the other party to be so strong, and their faces suddenly changed. And his body did not stand firmly and staggered slightly, almost falling to the ground. However, the mercenaries who usually live on the edge of a knife will naturally not show mercy. The big man once again swung the axe in his hand and took off the head of the guard directly without even a scream. Puff, the guard's head was chopped off and rolled to the ground, and blood spurted out like money. The headless body fell weakly against the wall and collapsed. At this moment, Viserys had already fled to the spiral staircase on the 3rd floor of the stone drum tower. He was panting heavily and just turned his head and saw this scene. The brave guard used his life to delay enough time for him, but he was killed by the brutal enemy in just a few moves. Viserys watched the enemy stride towards him again and felt his scalp slightly numb. Damn it. The silver-haired boy gritted his teeth slightly and then ran away again. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 28 Hiding. Viserys was being hunted by 3 vicious mercenaries. On the other side, Queen Rhaegar had returned to the bedroom with great effort, and 2 maids helped her take off her cumbersome outer clothes and put on pure white velvet pajamas, and then carefully lay on the soft big bed. My child, The woman lay quietly on the bed with her silver gold and long hair spread out, and her beautiful lavender eyes looked at the ceiling above her head. There was still an unshakable sadness in her eyes, and one hand stroked her bulging belly, slightly dazed. Rila's mental state now is really worrying, and she even got angry with Viserys for no reason, or cried for no reason. The woman had suffered too many blows, and had a little sign of madness. But now, Rila's mental state is still sober. I really don't know if it is right or wrong to bring you into this world. The family and the country were destroyed. As time passed, Rila also knew that Robert Baratheon on the other side of Blackwater Bay would not let them go so easily. Now the warships outside are fighting. Perhaps the navy built by Baratheon has already chased them. Rila herself is just a weak woman. She doesn't understand the situation of the war. She rarely asks about political affairs when she stays in the Red Castle on weekdays. She knows nothing about the so-called overall situation. However, she also understands that the barren Dragonstone Island has no people and no resources, and it cannot be defended. But where to go? She is unwilling to give up Dragonstone, and even resists it so much that she is going crazy, because giving up Dragonstone is equivalent to voluntarily withdrawing from Westeros and acknowledging the change of the Iron Throne. She is afraid that the string in her heart will break and hope will disappear. However, at the moment, she regrets that she should let the child in her belly come into this world. His or her fate in the future may be worse than that of a civilian. But now it is so big, and it is impossible for Rila to give up this child. This is the motivation that can support the woman who has been desperate to continue to live. Next to Queen Lila's bedroom is the room where the maids live, and there are several guards guarding the corridor. This is located on the upper floor of the main castle of Dragonstone Castle. From here, you can go up through the stone steps to the table hall, where Eagle Eye once made plans to conquer Westeros. The outside world was shouting and killing. 7 gods bless you. Rila Targaryen was lying on the bed, her long silver gold hair spread out, her towering chest gently rising and falling, and then she put her fingers on her forehead and prayed softly. Pray that this war will be victorious. While Rila was lying on the bed and thinking about it, something unexpected happened outside the bedroom door. First, the shouts of enemy attacks came from downstairs, which alarmed the guards guarding outside the bedroom door. Who is it? Then the guards responsible for protecting the queen seemed to have discovered something, and then drew their swords and shouted loudly. The next second, there was a clanging sound of weapons colliding outside Queen Rila's bedroom door, accompanied by screams. What happened? Queen Rila, who was pregnant, was frightened by the sudden movement outside, and hurriedly closed her clothes, and sat up from the bed. Her face was as pale as a piece of paper, and she was frightened again. Since the beginning of the War of the Usurper, Rila had not had a good sleep. In the past few years, especially in the past 6 months, since she fled to Dragonstone, she was worried every day, fearing that the enemy who wanted to kill her would arrive in front of her in the next second. Is the fleet defeated? Rila thought that the fleet loyal to Targaryen had failed, and the enemy had rushed to Dragonstone. Protect Her Majesty. However, the two sides were fighting fiercely outside the bedroom door, and no one could answer Queen Rila's question. Boom. The next moment, the wooden door of the bedroom shattered. A soldier from Dragonstone fell to the ground covered in blood, with an axe stuck in his chest. The mercenary group that came to attack accurately found the location of Queen Rila and Viserys, and the two sides started a fierce battle. On Viserys' side, he was still trying to avoid the enemy's pursuit. A room without any light. Darkness swallowed up Viserys' figure. No one lived in this room, and the air was filled with the smell of decay and dust. Haha, the silver-haired boy hid in a dilapidated wooden box, his chest rising and falling as he breathed heavily, leaving only a tiny gap to observe the outside world. He had just faced the pursuit of mercenaries, and had no choice but to hide in this uninhabited house, hoping to deceive them. However, something happened that disappointed Viserys. The voices of mercenaries were heard outside the house. Damn kid, you run fast. Viserys ran very fast, so they blocked him from front and back, trying to catch Viserys. However, they didn't expect to catch him in vain, which also meant that the silver-haired boy did not escape from here, and must be hiding in a room. HMPH. He's hiding here, he can't escape. Search every room. The tall mercenary with oil paint on his face waved his hand and asked the remaining 2 companions to search a room each. Try to find this little bastard as soon as possible and then take off his head to complete the commission. Find him and then kill him. After all, the longer they delay here, the more dangerous it will be. I should go to Dres. I hate to do things to children. The other mercenary with a black cloth wrapped on his face, tattered leather armor on his body, and a short sword on his waist spread out his hands and complained. Why don't you let me go for such a good job as dealing with the queen? Maybe it's okay. The mercenary exuded the smell of not having taken a bath for a long time, and then he laughed inexplicably, revealing his yellow teeth, which made people feel a little nauseous. The main reason was that the atmosphere had been relaxed a lot. After dealing with the guards in the castle, they felt that killing Viserys was a sure thing. What could a 7-year-old child do even if he hid? He held a big toothpick in his hand. What's the matter? Do you want to pick my teeth? However, the tall mercenary didn't have time to joke with this disgusting guy. He just glared at him, then opened a door and went in to search for Viserys. Another mercenary who was good at using a crossbow was also a little impatient. He was also very irritable. He took a look at the man and then spoke. Stop talking nonsense and do it. The voices of the mercenaries were particularly clear in front of the door, where Viserys was hiding. Then the door creaked and was pushed open. Viserys hid in the box. His heart was lifted high, and he tightly grasped the short sword tailored for him in his hand. Through the gap, he saw the fire in the corridor and the man who had just walked in standing outside the door. He was holding a crossbow in his hand. Chapter 29 Killing the Enemy. It's the guy with the crossbow. Viserys hid in the box and didn't dare to breathe, tightly holding the big toothpick in his hand. His fingernails were pinched white, and his heart was beating faster and faster. He continued to observe the other party through the gap in the box. The room was dark, with only a little firelight coming from the corridor, when the door was opened. The man with the crossbow in his hand had not yet discovered that there was an old and unremarkable wooden box in the corner of the utility room. The man kicked the debris on the ground with his feet, which slightly stirred up the dust. He coughed a few times, and then cursed himself, and then suddenly spoke in a slightly threatening voice. Hey, little thing, I know you are hiding here. You can hear me talking, and you are also secretly watching me, right? The man held the crossbow in his hand, and waved his hand to disperse the dust. Then he stood up slightly, and looked around the whole room, including the place in front of him, that was difficult to reach. He was quite experienced in dealing with children of this age. Although children are good at hiding, because of their physical advantages, they will reveal their true colors if they are frightened. The man tried his best to show a ferocious smile on his face, and then continued to threaten. Don't hide, I saw you. Is that corner of your clothes yours? However, as the mercenary threatened, the utility room remained silent, without any sound. Only the voice of the mercenary talking to himself echoed repeatedly, looking like a self-conceited clown. Damn it. The man holding the crossbow rubbed his teeth slightly. He realized that the little thing might not be hidden in this room. However, he still walked a few steps inside and continued to search. It was pitch black inside. Maybe Viserys was hiding in it. The mercenary walked into the depths of the utility room, and his figure was soon completely swallowed by the darkness. The light from outside the door only lasted to the position behind him. Bang! He kicked down an empty wooden barrel again, as if to vent his anger, and the lid fell to the ground. There was no one hiding inside. It seems that this little thing is really not hiding here. Lucky for you. The man holding the crossbow muttered, and was about to walk out the door to continue searching the next room. However, at this moment, he suddenly caught a glimpse of an inconspicuous wooden box in the corner from the corner of his eye. This wooden box didn't look big, and it would be a bit difficult for a 7-year-old child to hide in it. He didn't think about whether the Targaryen family's bastard would hide here. He thought of another point, whether the Targaryen family's treasure would be placed in this wooden box. Although the Targaryen family lost the Iron Throne, they have been the king of Westeros for more than 200 years after all, and I don't know how much wealth they have accumulated. And Dragonstone is the base camp of the Targaryen family. Maybe they will store a lot of wealth in this castle. The man holding the crossbow was slightly moved. Then he just wanted to give it a try. Anyway, these Targaryens were going to die, so it would be a waste if he didn't take it. Even if there were a few gold dragons, it would be good. Then he made up his mind and walked towards the wooden box in the corner. Without any precautions, he didn't expect that such a small box could hide a little boy. The man bent down slightly and wanted to open the lid of the wooden box. However, at this moment, bang, the lid of the wooden box was suddenly opened. The boy with silver gold hair was hiding in it. He held the dagger tightly in his hand and used all his strength to stab the other party's throat. At the same time, Viserys kept repeating the coach's words in his heart. Use the sharp end to stab the enemy. In fact, after more than half a year of practice, Viserys' swordsmanship is not very advanced, but at least he is no longer unfamiliar with the use of weapons. And the coach's teaching to the boy is mainly simple, that is, simple stab and cut, and then use it flexibly. The essence of swordsmanship is actually like this. Simple skills plus reasonable use can be invincible. After all, the mercenary holding the crossbow has experienced many battles. He reacted quickly when he was frightened and stressed, and tried his best to avoid his vital points. His right hand holding the crossbow also subconsciously blocked in front, and was pierced by the sword in Viserys' hand. Puff, the short sword pierced his wrist directly, and the sharp tip of the sword penetrated out. The man avoided the vital point, but his wrist was pierced, and the crossbow in his hand fell to the ground. He didn't expect that there would be a person hidden in such a small box, and he didn't expect that he would be almost killed by a sneak attack by a child. The mercenary covered his injured wrist with one hand. His face was shocked and angry, and he turned around and wanted to escape. Then, a scream broke out in the silent corridor. The tall mercenary, who was as tall as a mountain, was carrying a battle axe on his back. He was searching another room. He also rummaged through the boxes and cabinets carelessly and had no worries about a child who was only 7 years old and not as tall as him. Poor little guy. The muscles on Langdon's face jumped twice, looking a little ferocious, and then he roughly pulled down a wooden door. At this time, a clear scream came from the corridor. He recognized that it was the voice of his companion and couldn't help but frown slightly. I was actually hurt by a child? What a waste. Then Langdon threw away the wooden door in his hand, took off the battle axe behind him, and strode out to kill Viserys. On the other side, the mercenary with a wretched expression walked out of the door earlier than the big man. He also heard the screams of his companion, and then ran out with a sword in hand. He saw Viserys escaping from the utility room. The two were very close, and the room where Viserys was hiding was next to him. The silver-haired boy who escaped was covered with blood and dust and looked a little embarrassed. He held a short sword in one hand and a crossbow that he had just killed the enemy and took from him in the other hand. At this moment, the bowstring was tight and a crossbow arrow was already on the string. Seeing a mercenary chasing out, the distance between the two was so close that it was less than 2 meters. Viserys raised his hand without hesitation and fired the crossbow in his hand. Bang, the bowstring made a dull sound. The crossbow arrow stuck on it shot out instantly, tearing the air and making a whistling sound. Puff, the sharp crossbow arrow shattered the hard frontal bone of the mercenary without any hindrance, smashing directly into it, and the brain burst out with blood. At such a close distance, the opponent didn't even have time to react. This time he died even more painfully. Without a sound, his body was hit by the impact of the crossbow arrow and fell directly to the ground with his back facing the sky. Happy 2021, friends. Chapter 30 Failure. The body of the mercenary fell to the ground with his face up. Viserys had killed 2 enemies who attacked the castle in succession. His blood seemed to be boiling, but his mind was unusually clear at this moment. Then he met the eyes of the last enemy who ran out of another room. There is another one. The boy's pair of lavender eyes like gems blinked slightly. The tall enemy in front of him looked at Viserys with a shocked and stunned expression, and the atmosphere froze slightly for a while. He thought it was just a small accident, and didn't think his companion would be in any danger. He thought his companion might have just been bitten by a child, but he didn't expect to see such a scene when he walked out of the door. His companion's body fell to the ground with his face up, and a crossbow with a slightly shaking tail was stuck in his forehead. His mouth was slightly wide open, and he seemed to have not reacted yet, and blood was flowing out. Since this crossbow fell into the hands of this little thing, it is conceivable what happened to the other companion. No one can explain what emotions the complex expression on his face at this moment expressed. He never expected that such a harmless boy, like a frightened little rabbit, could kill two good fighters in their courageous regiment in a row. Damn little thing, I'm going to kill you. After a moment of daze, the next second, the tall man was furious. He rushed towards Viserys with a battle axe in hand, and the boy who had no crossbow in his hand did not hesitate, and threw away the crossbow in his hand, and then turned around, and ran away again. This crossbow was still a little difficult for him, and it took a lot of strength to string it, and he couldn't try his best to string it while running away, so he could only stand still, and step on it with one foot. But it was obvious that this enemy who looked very fierce would not give him such a chance. Run first. Viserys still didn't have any hesitation, and didn't want to fight with the other party, but chose to turn around and run away. However, this time Langdon no longer had any sympathy or carelessness for this boy, and strode after him. Stop. In his eyes, this boy was a little devil. You know, at what age did he kill his first person, when he was known for his cruelty in the regiment? He remembered that he was about 12 years old, but at that time he was already as big as an adult. An old man tried to climb onto his mother's bed in the middle of the night, but he found him and smashed him to death with a stone until he could no longer recognize his human form. Since then, no one in the village dared to bully them. When he became an adult, his mother died of illness. After burying his mother, he joined the Sellsword group alone. Because his methods were cruel enough to intimidate others, he was later called the Bloody Hand from Lies. However, the boy in front of him was much thinner than he was back then. He looked only 7 or 8 years old, and his thin shoulders seemed to be blown away by a gust of wind. But he showed a calmness that frightened him, which was even more frightening than he was back then. Viserys threw away his crossbow, because he didn't want to be burdened by the heavy crossbow, and then ran away. This time, the man raised the battle axe in his hand high while chasing him, and the muscles on his arm bulged. He aimed at Viserys' back, and threw it hard. He gave up on giving this boy of noble descent a decent death, and even more so, he would not give him any chance to struggle and escape. Langdon wanted to chop Viserys in half with his flying axe. However, the boy who turned around and ran away without any hesitation seemed to hear the wind behind him and turned his head slightly. Damn. Then he saw the battle axe that was constantly spinning and flying towards him. The boy's breathing stagnated slightly, and his scalp felt a little numb. If he was really hit by this flying axe, his small body would probably be cut in two. Then at this most critical moment, a complex hexagram array suddenly appeared in the eyes of the silver-haired boy, activating his special ability that awakened after his moon nature reached 20. Eye of the moment, in an instant. Like a breeze blowing. In an instant, everything around seemed to be quiet, and the speed of the battle axe's rotation was also slowed down to the extreme in Viserys' eyes at this moment. It was slowly spinning, drawing a trajectory. You must get out of the way. Viserys' body was as stiff as if he had sunk into a quagmire, and he gritted his teeth. However, despite this, the boy still tried his best to move his body, trying to avoid the spinning axe. The next second, whoosh in the mercenary's vision, the boy who was running in front suddenly stumbled to the side at an unexpected angle. It was as if he was tripped by something. But he just avoided the high-speed spinning axe. The sharp axe blade almost flew past the boy's shoulder, but his clothes were not even scratched. Boom. The heavy battle axe was nailed hard on the wall at the corner of the corridor, making a loud noise. However, Viserys staggered slightly and quickly stood firm, and the cold sweat on his forehead instantly slid down. That was close. He was really almost split in half just now, but fortunately he opened the Eye of Moment and dodged at the last moment. Then the boy took a deep breath and continued to run forward. However, Langdon, who was chasing Viserys, saw this scene and slightly widened his copper bell-like eyes with an expression of seeing a ghost. This is also possible? He couldn't believe his eyes. He never thought that Viserys could be so lucky to dodge his flying axe. However, the boy naturally didn't stay to explain anything, and then disappeared at the corner of the corridor. The battle on Queen Leela's side was also coming to an end. Although the mercenaries had more combat experience, they had not undergone much rigorous training. The guards came to support quickly and in larger numbers and soon defeated these mercenaries one by one. Kill them. Bang. Two Targaryen soldiers raised their shields high in front of them, forming a wall with their shields to directly trap the leader of the courageous corps in the corner. No matter how skilled the opponent was, they could not break this shield wall with their left and right slashes. Then the other few people stabbed directly into the gaps in the shields. Puff, puff, puff. A shrill scream came from the shield. Blood flowed out, and the leader of the courage group was stabbed to death in the corner. Leave one alive. On the other side, another mercenary was captured alive and tied up. Queen Leela, who was wearing pajamas, was hiding by the closet with a slight tremor under the support of her maid. Except for some mental stimulation again, she did not suffer any injuries. Chapter 31 Cruel. On the other side, the mercenary called Carrying Axe actually had a faint intention to retreat in his heart. He wanted to abandon the rest of the brothers and retreat alone. For these mercenaries, brothers, and feelings are like farts, and they all laugh it off. They are all doing this kind of business that puts their heads on the belt for money. No one knows how long they can live. Or if they close their eyes tonight, they can open them tomorrow. As a mercenary, he may die at any time due to some accidents. Take the bottom mercenaries in their courage group for example. The blood exchange is very frequent. He himself is also a middle and higher level in the courage group because of his good strength. And a newcomer who just joined some time ago. The two of them said hello to each other, and in a few days, the other party may become a corpse and be carried back. Life and death are too familiar to these people. Life is to move on a woman's belly, bent or try to leave a seed for yourself. Death means lying on the ground carelessly, regardless of whether it is the seven gods, the old gods, the black goat god, Ruler, the Lord of Light, or the weeping Lady of Lies, his hometown, etc. Whoever's kingdom of God can accept him, he can be a slave. However, no one has ever died, and God knows if he can really see these gods after death. Even if he makes a lot of money, he doesn't know who to give it to for safekeeping, so he can only squander it wantonly and enjoy himself in time. Therefore, for such a person, there is no scruple. When the situation is not right, it is the most normal thing to sell teammates, and it is not the first time to stab in the back. At this moment, he was walking cautiously in the stone drum tower, holding an axe in one hand, and the other hand was holding the shield just seized from the body of the guard. He dared not take Viserys lightly, because of his age. This little thing, the mercenary's mind moved slightly, and his eyes turned. There was an accident in the task of killing the little prince, and even two people were lost. No one knew what was happening on the other side. The entire castle seemed to have awakened, and the servants and guards were all awakened. Even if they killed Queen Rhaella, it would be difficult for them to escape. Forget it. Don't blame me, let's retreat first. The mercenary gritted his teeth slightly, and finally made up his mind to abandon the rest of his brothers and retreat first. Even if King Robert offered a high stake, it would be better to be alive. He didn't want to have money, but no life to spend. Then the tall man touched the rope around his waist, then turned over and rode on the stone window. He was going to use the rope to escape from the castle again from the stone window, and then find their ship to leave Dragonstone. The man turned his head left and right and looked around. He found that there was no one around, and then he was relieved. He didn't know where Viserys had escaped to. This little thing ran very fast, and he had lost it long ago. Click, then the mercenary fixed it on the wall with a hook, and pulled it hard to make sure the rope was fixed. Then he put his battle axe and shield on his back, and carefully confirmed that there was no one around. Then he pulled the rope with both hands, and went outside the castle. His body completely disappeared into the darkness. Crash, as the rope continued to descend, the mercenary grasped the rope, and slid down skillfully. Escaped. The mercenary breathed a sigh of relief. However, he did not feel any guilt in his heart. The death of others had nothing to do with him. It was enough to know that he could escape. But when he was halfway down, something horrifying happened to the mercenary. He suddenly felt the rope sway slightly, but it was not his own shaking, but some other force was shaking the rope. The big man with oil paint on his face was stunned for a moment, then raised his head and saw a small figure appearing in the window he had just come out of. Because he was leaning against the light source, he could not see the other person's cheeks and facial expressions clearly. However, Langdon could still recognize at a glance that the other person was the little Prince Viserys who had just been chased by him. Oh no. The mercenary's heart sank slightly, knowing that something bad was going to happen. No. His strong arms were muscular, and he held the rope tightly. His throat rolled slightly, and he swallowed a mouthful of saliva. He didn't want to die yet. In fact, if he could live, no one wanted to die. However, Langdon, who was a little famous among the mercenaries in the disputed land, was really panicking at this time. Although he was given the title of Bloodhand from Rhys, because of his ruthlessness, he even killed 10 slaves in the arena alone, and won the cheers of the whole audience. However, now, no matter how strong his courage is, it is not enough to save him at this time. The mercenary stepped on the outer wall of the castle, and lowered his head slightly, to take a look at the cliff below. However, it was pitch black below and nothing could be seen clearly, as if a bloody mouth was waiting to swallow him up, without even a bone residue left. Crash, the waves kept hitting the jagged reefs below, and on the sea in the distance, this war seemed to have gradually come to an end. The King Island fleet came in a large force this time, not to conquer Dragonstone Island in one go. After all, he had no reason to refuse the king's order, but Lord Redwyne didn't want his team to suffer too much. After all, the King Island fleet was the private property of the Redwyne family, and he would feel sorry for every warship and soldier that was lost. So after a simple test and a show of strength, Lord Redwyne commanded the fleet to withdraw from the battlefield. The commander of the Dragonstone Island fleet also knew that, after losing the supply from Westeros, the fleet was now eating up all the resources, so he also did not pursue the victory, but let the King Island fleet withdraw from the battlefield in an orderly manner. However, at this moment, no one could understand the fear in the heart of the mercenary who was hanging in the air, unable to advance or retreat, and dared not retreat. I don't want to die yet. The location of the Dragonstone Island castle is on the cliff by the sea, and he is now less than halfway down, and there is at least 20 yards below. If he really falls from here, I'm afraid there will be no room for struggle, and he will be smashed directly to pieces. After all, there are rocks below. Your Highness, please forgive my crime. The mercenary panicked and held the rope tightly, wanting to beg Viserys for mercy. However, he opened his mouth, but didn't know what to say, and his voice was blown away by the wind. Viserys stood in front of the stone window, looking at the mercenary trapped on the cliff with a calm look. He panted slightly. Then he drew the dagger from his waist and placed it on the hemp rope, and then chopped it down fiercely. Chapter 32 Connection. Then the rope was cut. There was a desperate roar from below, and then a slight pause, and finally a dull sound came from below, like the sound of a rucksack filled with heavy objects falling to the ground. Bang, all the sounds stopped, only the waves would not stop. The bloody hand from Lys fell off the cliff alive and died. Viserys stood alone on the castle, looking at the dark hole below, and couldn't see anything clearly. The hook on the other side also fell to the ground with a crisp sound. Viserys lay on the stone window and panted slightly. It's over. Because of his lack of height, he actually lay on the edge of the stone window and leaned out, then drew his sword and cut the opponent's rope, causing him to fall off the cliff. Although it was midnight and the outside of the castle was completely shrouded in darkness, it was pitch black and nothing could be seen from the stone window, but Viserys was sure that the opponent must be dead. There was no need to confirm it. Having lived in Dragonstone for half a year, Viserys was different from Rhaenys, who was so heartless. He had memorized all the complex terrain in the castle. Moreover, he heard the sound of a heavy object falling to the ground. There was no doubt that the other party did not fall into the sea, but only fell on the rocky beach and died with a bloody head. I killed someone again. And now, the boy jumped down from the stone window, leaned against the wall of the corridor with some weakness, and then slid down to sit on the cold ground, not wanting to move even a finger. Viserys was so tired that he was a little exhausted. If it weren't for the strong desire to survive, he might have been unable to run when he was chased. The boy sat on the ground and took a deep breath, then raised his hand and wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. The blood splashed on his face had solidified a lot and merged with the newly seeped sweat. With the boy's tender and cute face and clear lavender eyes, this strong and weird contrast looked a little chilling. Such a cute and innocent little boy used various means in a short period of time. Sneak attack, hiding, and designed to kill 3 vicious mercenaries. Viserys' long hair like molten silver was pressed against his cheeks, and he panted to calm his rapidly beating heart. Then he began to have time to recall the whole thing. What happened? When he was suddenly attacked just now, Viserys didn't react at all, but just knew that these people were here to kill him. Then he ran away desperately, hit, sneak attacked and killed the mercenaries all for survival. However, until now he didn't know who these people were and why they came to kill him. Viserys' first thought was that King Robert wanted to wipe out the roots, and in fact his first thought was almost right. As for who these people were, it touched Viserys' knowledge blind spot. As for the continent of Essos on the other side of the narrow sea, Viserys was completely in the dark and knew very little, except for the part recorded in his favorite travel notes. As for the mercenaries in this courageous group, he didn't know anything at all. Then his attention fell on the black smoke absorbed by the people he had just killed. Clang. He drew out the short sword in his hand, and there were some mottled blood stains on the clear sword. This was left when he killed the first mercenary. The sword reflected light slightly under the firelight, and Viserys' eyes were fixed on this reflection. 3 seconds later, this group of black mist condensed again. It was still expressed in the High Valyrian language, which was the sun, moon, water, and earth, and translated into the common languages strength, spirit, agility, and body. Viserys didn't know what the nature of this group of black mist was, but there was one thing he could be completely sure of. That is, this group of black mist, that is, his golden finger, had an inexplicable relationship with the Valyrian freehold that was destroyed hundreds of years ago because of the wrath of the gods. When he just landed on Dragonstone for his coronation half a year ago, he fainted under the gaze of the 7 gods, and then dreamed of many strange dreams. Among them, the most memorable and the longest one was a doomsday disaster. Volcanoes erupted, the earth split, the magnificent cities were destroyed, and the land was torn apart into islands. Since then, the most prosperous civilization in human history, even known as the civilization that can challenge the gods, has been completely wiped out from the earth. The remains of Valyria have become the Sea of Smoke and Devil's Land in people's mouths today. It seems that it still has some strong influence or curse power. It has been almost 400 years since it has been set foot by humans, and its secrets will remain there forever. The Targaryen family was once a member of the Valyrian civilization. 12 years before the Doomsday, a prophet was born in a powerless family in the Valyrian freehold. She anticipated the arrival of the Doomsday, so she persuaded the whole family to come to Dragonstone, the outpost of Valyria near the western continent, and escaped. And this family with no power in the Valyrian freehold was the Targaryen family who later conquered Westeros and ruled this land for nearly 300 years. These are what Viserys learned after he landed on Dragonstone and read the books stored here. After all, this is the base camp of the Targaryen family. At the same time, the old scholar also told Viserys a lot of stories about Valyrian civilization. After all, this is the family history of the Targaryens. While learning about the family history of other nobles, one should naturally know what happened to his own family. Maybe, one day I will solve this secret. Viserys looked at the rolling black fog, including the words composed in the High Valyrian language, and said secretly in his heart, Viserys Targaryen, strength, sun. 5 constitution, soil. 6 agility, water drop. 8 spirit, moon. 20 At the same time, there is a wisp of black smoke cruising outside the black fog. He was intentionally controlled after Viserys absorbed it when he killed the first mercenary just now, and did not let it directly merge into his body. Viserys wanted to try whether he could control this wisp of black smoke to strengthen the ability he wanted to strengthen. The 2 enemies he killed later did not absorb the black smoke. Viserys guessed that this might be related to the enemies he killed with long-range weapons. The condition for absorbing the black mist from the opponent is that you must kill the enemy with your own hands. Only when the 2 sides have direct contact can you absorb the power. And what is the nature of this power, Viserys also does not know. Did he absorb the opponent's soul? Or, the life force in the corpse has not completely disappeared. Chapter 33 Sir Geoffrey. And now, Viserys is still in the exploration stage of the black mist, and the road ahead is full of confusion. So he wants to take the initiative to try other possibilities. Even if it may not be so practical now, everything still needs to be explored. Therefore, give it a try. Viserys pursed his lips, and his eyes looked at the last attribute in the black mist. The moon expressed in High Valyrian language represents the option of mental power. The Valyrians believe that the moon represents the spirit, soul or will. This is an expression feature of this language. The word moon can also refer to the soul. My mental power far exceeds that of ordinary people, and it does bring me special abilities. When Viserys' moon attribute reached 20, he awakened a special ability called the Eye of Moment. This ability allows him to temporarily slow down all people or objects that are undergoing dynamic changes within his field of vision, and the powerful mental power deconstructs the opponent's actions in an instant. So it seems that the opponent has slowed down, leaving him with more sufficient reaction time. This ability is of great help to Viserys. For example, he just used this ability to avoid the flying axe thrown by the mercenary and saved his life. Viserys also understands the principle of playing to one's strengths and avoiding one's weaknesses. His strength now lies in his spiritual power that is far superior to that of ordinary people. He even looks forward to what changes will happen if his spiritual power evolves to the extreme. Then, Viserys controlled the absorbed black smoke to merge into the large black fog, turning into a fleeting moonlight, and the words symbolizing moon were wrapped in a layer of faint white light. Then there was nothing else. Viserys sat on the ground against the wall and looked at the sword in his hand. Fortunately, the castle of Dragonstone is large enough. Because of Prince Rhaegar's frugality and the poverty of Dragonstone, there are not many servants and guards, and no one has discovered him yet. Otherwise, seeing this scene, people might think that this little king can't bear the psychological pressure and wants to choose to end his life. Sure enough, Viserys looked calm. He looked at the number of the moon, which was still 20, without any change. His brain was slightly clear, like drinking nectar, and then his eyes blinked slightly. There was no surprise, but an expression of reason. He did not waste this black smoke, but used it to test a result. Although he roughly guessed the result, but facing something as important as the black fog, Viserys was very cautious. He would not choose to guess, but must use experimental results to prove it. And the result was as he expected. The stronger the ability, the more difficult it is to evolve. His mental power has far exceeded the sum of 2 people, even 3, 4 or more people. So his plan to quickly evolve his mental power to the peak has also failed. It still needs comprehensive development. Viserys took a deep breath. And I don't know if the use of black fog will cause any hidden dangers. But now Viserys has no choice. He must rely on the benefits brought to him by the black fog. Otherwise it will be difficult and even impossible to turn the tide for the foreseeable future. Even with the help of the black mist, Viserys did not relax at all. He was afraid that he would not be able to escape the shackles of fate and would eventually die in other ways. For this reason, he dared not relax. Your Highness is here. Come quickly. At this time. Tap tap tap, accompanied by the friction of armor and the noisy and chaotic footsteps, the guards of the castle held torches and searched in the corridor and finally found Viserys' location along the traces. All the mercenaries who sneaked into the castle had been killed. After a brief interrogation, the only survivor was ordered by the steward Ser Shad, who hurried over to cut his throat and throw his body into the sea. Hearing about the attack, the knight looked very anxious and at the same time hated these attackers and wanted to kill them as soon as possible. At this time, the guards also found that the bedroom where the little king was also attacked by the enemy. 2 guards had been killed, and Viserys and Princess Rhaenys disappeared without a trace. Then Ser Shad ordered a search of the entire castle. Finally, they found the frightened Rhaenys in the cellar, and another team also found Viserys' location. The next morning, the horror of last night had disappeared. The servants cleaned up the blood in the castle, and all the bodies of the mercenaries were thrown into the sea to feed the fish. The body of the mercenary who fell off the cliff after Viserys cut the rope from the castle was also found by the fishermen who were preparing to go out to sea to fish in the morning. Viserys was actually a little frightened, but he probably behaved better than the Queen and Rhaenys. But he was also tossed for half a night without sleep, and there was still some bloodshot in his eyes. Mother. In the table hall on the top floor of the stone drum tower, Viserys greeted his mother and sat on the side seat. The exhausted silver-haired woman was sitting on the main seat listening to the report of the commander of the Dragonston fleet. Although Viserys had been crowned as the king, in fact, even the guards of Dragonston did not call him Your Majesty. Everyone understood that this king was just a title. Even if Targaryen regained the throne now, Viserys could not sit on the Iron Throne. Because he was too young, his mother Rhaella was the regent as the Queen Mother, and she would transfer power when the king came of age. So Viserys could only sit on the side seat beside his mother in an orderly manner, with his knees together, and his hands on his knees. His long eyelashes moved, his eyes drooped, and he looked quiet, just like an obedient and sensible child. However, the commander of the Dragonston fleet, an old man with white hair and beard, was saying something. He noticed Viserys' arrival and slightly tilted his head to look at the boy. There was still a little curiosity in the old knight's eyes. He was reporting to Queen Rhaella about the losses of the Dragonston fleet last night. Although the enemy was repelled, the fleet itself inevitably suffered some losses. And he also heard what happened in the castle. His Highness's younger brother, Prince Viserys, who was only 7 years old, killed 3 vicious mercenary group members last night by some unknown method. Your Highness. The commander of the Dragonston fleet nodded slightly to Viserys. Said Joffrey. Viserys nodded after hearing the old man's words and politely returned the greeting. This was the first time he had met this lord since he arrived at Dragonston. He was in charge of the fleet, but had not come to see Queen Rhaella and Viserys since they arrived. And his mother didn't know why she hadn't taken the initiative to summon this man. Chapter 34 Bold Ideas. Your Majesty. The old knight with white hair and beard had a rough voice, and then nodded slightly. All the words that needed to be said had been said. Queen Rhaella was still sitting in the most central seat, with a big belly and a haggard face. After taking a deep breath, she nodded. Thank you, said Joffrey. However, the old man did not say anything, but stood up and bowed slightly, and the armor on his body made a sound. Then he was ready to leave the table hall and return to the fleet, docked in the port. At this time, Viserys, who had been listening for a long time, looked at Sir Joffrey and suddenly raised his hand, like a well-behaved child in class. Sir, I have a question. Can our fleet sail across the narrow sea? The young king sat on the side seat with one hand on the table, and raised the other hand and spoke abruptly. HMM. The old knight was slightly startled when he heard Viserys' words, and then stopped. He lowered his head and looked at the panoramic map of Westeros in the drawing room. The location of Dragonston is the gateway to King's Landing, and behind Blackwater Bay is the narrow sea between the 2 continents. On the other side of the narrow sea is what the people of Westeros call the Eastern Continent or Western Coast. Its scientific name is the continent of Essos, where the 9 free trade cities are located. Viserys suddenly asked this question at this time. Although he was only 7 years old, he had to make the old knight fall into deep thought. Your Highness means. Sir Joffrey was silent for a moment, then raised his grey head and asked back. Dragonston is too barren. First, there are no resources, and second, there is no population. Viserys' 2 little hands were tucked into the sleeves of the blue velvet robe, and he clenched his fists slightly. On the surface, he looked very calm, but in fact, the boy was still a little nervous. Even more nervous than when he killed 3 mercenaries last night. Because this was the first time he took the initiative to express his opinion, he knew what would happen in the future, so he wanted to seek change. The Dragonston fleet, a powerful force that is still loyal to Targaryen, naturally cannot be buried in the storm for no reason. In 3 months, his sister will come to this world, and she will come to this world with the biggest storm in hundreds of years or even in history. This storm destroyed the last fleet of Targaryen, and buried them all in the port. Dragonston surrendered without a fight. The young Viserys was forced to take his sister, who was only in his cradle, into exile in the East Continent, and was fostered and wandered in various powerful families. If Viserys wants to change his future destiny, he must firmly grasp this fleet that is still loyal to Targaryen at this time, and never allow them to be destroyed by that storm. So Viserys changed his previous low-key and silent attitude at this time, seized this opportunity, and bravely stood up to express his opinions. Even though he is very young now, his words may be regarded as farts by them, but he still wants to try. He persuaded his mother and Sir Joffrey to listen to his opinions. Even if it is only a little bit. After hearing Viserys' words, Sir Geoffrey remained silent, with one hand on the map. It was hard to tell what the old man was thinking. Viserys was relieved to see that the other party did not directly object. He was most afraid that the other party would treat his words as a child's joke because of his age. Then he spoke again with more sharp words. Mother and Sir Geoffrey. The 7-year-old little king sat on the chair, mustered up his courage, and looked at Queen Rhaella and the commander of the Dragonstone fleet. If we are trapped on Dragonstone and do not seek to change the current situation, defeat is probably just a matter of time. Viserys' words this time were not euphemistic at all, and he spoke sharply and directly. When Queen Rhaella heard her son's words, her face changed slightly. She hated Viserys for saying such unlucky words. The woman had become a little neurotic because of the frequent stimulation and accidents during this period, and the word defeat stimulated her even more. Viserys. Queen Rhaella's voice was sharp, and she was ready to reprimand her son for speaking without restraint. So, however, the fleet commander, who had been silent for a long time, suddenly interrupted him. Sir Geoffrey held the map with one hand, raised his head, and stared at Viserys, who was sitting on the other side of the map with his grey-brown eyes. What do you want to do? He didn't expect that the child would suddenly say such a thing. It takes more than just courage. In addition, the news he heard last night, that the child killed 3 sellswords through some means. Geoffrey suddenly became interested in Viserys. Could Viserys really have the potential to grow into the next Prince Rhaegar? The former Silver Prince has unimaginable influence among the many Targaryen families. Everyone thinks that Rhaegar must be the greatest king in the history of the Targaryen dynasty when he sits on the Iron Throne. Until now, Rhaegar has been dead for more than half a year, and these people still think so. And Viserys also looked at the other side with a sharp look, not showing any weakness. But he didn't know that he was once again compared with his almost perfect brother in the hearts of others. After receiving Sir Geoffrey's response, Viserys felt more confident and once again boldly expressed his thoughts. Sir, we can give up Dragonstone and seize a city in the East Continent as our new residence. Give up Dragonstone? The grey-haired old man narrowed his eyes slightly when he heard Viserys' bold idea. Dragonstone, as the dragon's birthplace of the Targaryen family's conquest of Westeros, has important historical and practical significance. Moreover, if the Targaryens directly give up Dragonstone now, it is equivalent to giving up their claim to the Iron Throne, and in disguised form, recognizing the legitimacy of the usurper. The geographical location of Dragonstone is also very important. As the gateway to the Sea of King's Landing, the Dragonstone fleet is still blocking the entrance and exit of the entire Blackwater Bay. Even though the Baratheon family is full of anger, they do not have a strong navy to challenge the royal fleet, so they can only take a detour. The old lord did not expect that when the situation is not so bad now, Viserys actually lost his courage and wanted to propose to give up Dragonstone. He gave up his claim to the Iron Throne and fled to the East Continent like a stray dog. Was it because of what happened last night that frightened the child? But this is also normal. After all, Prince Viserys is only a 7-year-old child. He can't expect everyone to be as good as Prince Rhaegar. The old knight understood very well, but was also a little disappointed. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 35, Taking the Initiative. Yes, Viserys was very sensitive to the disappointment in the old knight's tone, and his heart sank a little. But on the surface, he still spoke calmly. If we want to retake the Iron Throne, it is not enough to rely on the ships and resources in front of us. At the same time, Viserys secretly thought that even Aegon conquered Westeros not only with 3 dragons, but also with the army. He landed first at the location of King's Landing today and built a small castle called Aegon Castle with wood. He made the Rosby family and the Stokeworth family surrender quickly, and then officially started the War of Conquest. What's more, the Targaryens no longer have dragons. If they want to counterattack Westeros with just a fleet, it is undoubtedly a foolish dream. And if they stick to Dragonstone Island and don't leave without replenishing resources, then defeat is only a matter of time. What you said makes sense, child, but you don't understand the actual situation. However, when Viserys was about to say something, he was interrupted by the old knight. The address also changed from Your Highness to addressing a child. The old knight was still a little disappointed. It seemed that Viserys was not yet up to his brother's level. But it didn't matter. He was still young and could be trained. If it was Prince Rhaegar who was here. No. Prince Rhaegar had already been defeated. In fact, if it weren't for Rhaegar and Lyanna's selfish desires, they wouldn't have provoked this usurper war at all. The whole country could have at least continued for a few more years under the Mad King's torment. Suddenly thinking of this, the old knight felt a little confused. It seemed that there was something wrong with the goal he had been pursuing, and his voice paused. The whole table hall fell into silence in an instant. Queen Rhaegar, who was sitting on the main seat with a big belly, had some problems with her mental state because of the heavy blow she had suffered in the past 6 months. She heard Viserys' words, and then her emotions became excited again. Dragonstone had a very strong meaning to her. Even though she understood it, she couldn't really give up Dragonstone and flee to the East Continent. Impossible. The silver-haired woman didn't get enough rest last night. Her beautiful lavender eyes were bloodshot, and her hair was a little messy. She slammed the table and said sharply, "Your Majesty." However, the old knight raised his hand slightly at this time to try to interrupt Queen Rhaegar. But the emotional woman didn't care. She was determined not to allow such a thing to happen. "It is absolutely impossible to give up Dragonstone, Your Majesty." However, Sir Geoffrey also raised his voice suddenly, interrupting Queen Rhaegar's words again, and finally made the other party shut up temporarily. He had interrupted what Queen Rhaegar and Viserys wanted to say one after another, but Queen Rhaegar didn't dare to get angry with the other party, because now the last force of the Dragonstone fleet was in his hands. Queen Rhaegar and Viserys didn't dare to offend each other. After interrupting the woman's voice, the old knight looked at Viserys up and down with a sharp gaze, and then continued to speak. "The actual situation is, Your Highness, the 9 free trade cities will not allow us to get involved. The 9 free trade cities seem to be loose and even full of contradictions, but they will show unity when facing foreign enemies. Because this is related to their vital interests, they do not want an external force to break this balance. And although this force is not very strong, it is at least not to be ignored, and even because of their identity, it may cause a war in the future. If only Viserys and his widow escape to the continent of Essos, the 9 free trade cities might open their arms and actively accept them, in order to create a little trouble for Westeros. If Viserys came to the East Continent with a fleet, the attitude of the trade cities would change drastically. Because they know that the Iron Throne on the other side of the Narrow Sea may ignore a pair of orphans and widows, but will never allow Targaryen to make a comeback in the continent of Essos. So in the future, there is a high possibility that a tragic war will break out between the 2 continents, just like the Battle of the 9 Copper Plate Kings many years ago. The Iron Throne will never allow a person who has the opportunity to challenge his position in the future to continue to survive, and may even take the initiative to attack. These unstable factors led them to accept Viserys and Queen Rhaegar, and even actively help them escape to Dragonstone, in order to cause some trouble for the Iron Throne. But they will never allow Viserys to come with a fleet. So that's how it is. When Viserys heard this, his expression was very clear, and he was slightly stunned. He was not very clear about these details. After all, he was just talking on paper now. Viserys knew a lot, but he also didn't know there were more. These are some tiny details hidden in this magnificent pattern. However, these small details often affect the overall situation. "Sorry, sir." Viserys still sat in the chair and hesitated for a while, but he couldn't say any better excuses. In fact, any Iron Alliance will have its loose places, not to mention the 9 free trade cities that are still fighting among themselves. If you want to find an opportunity, you can definitely find it. However, Viserys did not say so, because it would make people sound like he was quibbling, and what happened just now also sounded a wake-up call for him. Nothing is as simple as he sees on the surface. He cannot use "I think" as a basis for judgment and decision making. Anything needs to be proved by solid evidence to prove his rationality. Viserys was very glad that he was not a person in power now. If the old knight had not hesitated and listened to his advice directly, it might have caused serious consequences. If the road to the free trade city was cut off, then Viserys and his mother would really have no way out. Thinking of this, Viserys even felt a slight chill on his back. Then he raised his head and apologized to Sir Geoffrey. "I was too careless." However, the old knight stood in front of the map and put away his arrogant expression. His expression slightly relaxed and accepted Viserys' apology and then abruptly said, "But your highness's words did remind me." "What?" Viserys was slightly stunned. He was just immersed in the frustration of failing in his first attempt to show his presence, but he didn't expect the old knight to say this suddenly. Then he heard the other party continue to say, "We really shouldn't sit and wait for death. Instead, we should take the initiative to attack." Chapter 36 The Storm is Coming. June of the 284th year of the Conquest era. 3 months passed in a flash. The gloomy sky was covered with thick clouds, as if a heavy rain was about to come. In the distance, the naked eye could see that a storm was brewing, with lightning and thunder, heavy rain and strong winds. Under this natural disaster, warships were deployed on the sea, sailing silently through the waves. They sailed to the distance. Viserys was standing on the second deck of the Black Death at this moment, facing the howling sea breeze, his silver gold and long hair fluttering in the wind, revealing his white forehead. The boy was wearing clean and tidy leather armor with metal plates and laid on key parts such as the chest and abdomen, to protect the vital parts. He wore a short sword on his waist, held a bow in his hand, and carried a quiver on his back, looking heroic. On the deck below him, there were many soldiers who were busy with their own work, taking down the hoisted sails, fixing things on the deck that could not be dragged to the warehouse, and preparing to meet the coming storm with all their strength. "The storm is coming, Your Highness." At this time, a hoarse and vicissitudes voice came from behind Viserys. It was Sir Geoffrey, the commander of the Dragonstone fleet. The old man had changed his casual clothes and put on armor because they were not far from the destination of this trip. "Why did you choose to launch the attack at this time?" As a veteran who had been displaced on the sea for most of his life, Sir Geoffrey was naturally no stranger to storms. Half a month ago, the sky near Dragonstone was already gloomy and terrible. It seemed that a big storm was coming. Originally, Sir Geoffrey decided to let all the ships of the Dragonstone fleet hide in the port in the next few days and wait for the storm tide to pass. According to the old knight's half-life experience on the sea, the storm was not terrible. As long as they did not go out to sea in the few days when the storm came and the ships were tied with ropes, the losses from a storm would not be too great. However, for some reason, Viserys wanted to propose a surprise attack on the Baratheon fleet that was being built at Storm's End and had not yet taken shape. The reason he gave was that the enemy would never think that they would launch a surprise attack when the storm was about to come. And at this time, all the enemy's warships can be destroyed in one go, which will deal a heavy blow to the enemy's morale. This kind of half-crossing and attacking is more useful than harassing Storm's End from the beginning to prevent them from building a fleet. And it can also lead the fleet to successfully avoid the attack of this storm surge. However, although Viserys was eloquent, the content was actually a bit dry and did not have much weight. And this is actually a very risky behavior. But what no one expected was that after careful consideration, the old knight actually agreed to Viserys' bold adventure. So the Dragonstone fleet set sail and escaped from the center of the vortex where the storm was coming at the fastest speed, passed through the Blackwater Bay in the throat where the storm was coming, bypassed the sharp corner, and sailed to the distance. At the beginning, everything was fine. The fleet left Dragonstone very early and evacuated before the storm came. However, in the next few days, as the fleet traveled on the sea, the old knight's heart became colder and colder, and he even felt a little scared. Because the fleet had been sailing for several days and still hadn't left the coverage of this storm, it was enough to see how huge the scale of this storm would be. If he hadn't listened to Viserys' advice and stubbornly decided to let the fleet dock at the port in the hope of forcing through the storm, then now this royal fleet would have suffered a heavy blow and almost completely swallowed by the sea. So he was very curious about how Viserys made such a judgment, and why he asked the fleet to leave Dragonstone for an expedition at the critical time when the queen was about to give birth. Could it be that this boy also predicted that this storm would be unprecedentedly huge? Did your highness guess something? The old knight asked curiously. At this time, boom, the sea was turbulent, and the surging waves hit the deck fiercely. The storm finally caught up with the fleeing Dragonstone fleet half a month later. Crash, a heavy rain fell in an instant, wantonly venting the anger accumulated in the past few days. The soldiers on the lower deck were busy fixing things on the deck. Viserys stood above, holding on to the railing. The whistling sea wind filled his ears, almost drowning out the voices of the two people talking. The boy struggled to hear what Sir Geoffrey said, then shook his head and responded loudly, "No, I guessed too." However, the old knight was not satisfied with this answer. He also held onto the railing tightly, raised his head, and looked at the dark sky in the distance. The heavy rain was pouring down overhead, with strong winds and heavy rain. "Oh, is it?" Then he retracted his gaze into the distance, turned his head, and looked at the boy meaningfully. Since the old and the young met once 3 months ago, Sir Geoffrey felt that the boy seemed to have some magic, sometimes acting very smart, and sometimes looking a little stupid. The reason why he agreed to Viserys' risky move and set out on an expedition before the storm was about to come was because he had received a letter from the Citadel not long ago. The Citadel has a maester who is specifically responsible for observing astronomical phenomena, and in recent days has delivered letters to the cities and islands along the east coast of Westeros. All of them show that according to the observation of the astronomer, the most powerful storm surge in history will be born in the Narrow Sea in the near future. The astronomer wearing the bronze bachelor's collar predicts that the largest storm surge vortex in the history of Westeros will be near Dragonstone. The Citadel did not change its attitude because of the change of the Iron Throne. The purpose of the Maesters is to serve all mankind. The Maesters, like the Brothers of the Night's Watch, are considered to be servants of Westeros. In theory, any Maester has no political inclination. Therefore, they also sent a letter to Dragonstone to convey a warning message. However, Sir Geoffrey did not take it seriously at first. But as the terrible celestial phenomenon became more and more obvious, the old knight's heart could not help but beat the drum. But he did not make up his mind after all. After all, the queen is about to give birth, and the fleet should guard the side of Dragonstone to prevent any accidents from happening again. However, Viserys' words were like the last straw that broke the camel's back and finally made the old knight determined to lead the fleet to escape from Dragonstone. If the entire fleet was destroyed in the storm, the safety of the queen would naturally not be guaranteed. Chapter 37, Stannis. In Storm's End, a man with a straight back and a resolute face sat at a round wooden table, writing something. On the clean and tidy table was a half-burned white wax. The candlelight was gently swayed by the wind coming through the window, casting his shadow on the wall behind him. It was raining heavily outside the window, and the noisy rain made him a little upset. Then, snap, the pen in his hand was accidentally broken, and Stannis' face looked a little bad. Then he threw the broken pen directly to the wall on the side. For some reason, Stannis was a little uneasy at this time. The sudden break of the pen was like a sign before something bad happened. The muscle between the man's eyebrows twisted into a knot, and then he raised his hand and rubbed his temple slightly with his rough fingers, trying to make himself more awake. But it didn't help. Then the pale lips tightened, and Stannis was now worried. He had long forgotten how to smile, let alone what it meant to be happy. His elder brother Robert Baratheon has now become the king. The traditional fiefdom of the Baratheon family, Storm's End, should be handed over to the next heir. Of course, the king can continue to keep Storm's End until he chooses an excellent heir and then divides it. However, Stannis is undoubtedly the first heir to Storm's End. His younger brother Renly is just a child and poses no threat to him. At least that's what Stannis thinks. Even before his elder brother Robert gave birth to an heir, he could even be considered the first heir to the Iron Throne as a younger brother. But Stannis suddenly has a bad premonition now. The reason may be the bad personal relationship with his brother and the lack of news from King's Landing. Maybe Robert just wants to recapture Dragonstone first. Stannis loosened his fingers kneading his temple, sighed, and then talked to himself. The knot formed by the muscles between his eyebrows also loosened a little. Although he had an uneasy relationship with his brother and had some complaints about his way of dealing with things, Stannis was still loyal and never doubted his brother. He knew how much Robert hated the Targaryens, and he gave himself an explanation in his heart. Perhaps Robert just wanted to recapture Dragonstone first and then hand over Storm's End to him. Now, since Lord Ridwine's fleet returned from Dragonstone in defeat, it has returned to the west coast of Westeros to recuperate, and King Robert's determination to recapture Dragonstone has not wavered at all. Stannis is still staying in Storm's End, rushing to build warships and train the Royal Navy. Now most of the newly built warships have been launched, and the newly trained navy has already taken shape. Stannis is full of ambition and thinks that after his Royal Navy training is successful, it will be easy to recapture Dragonstone. Is my brother in there? At this time, a boy's childish and slightly excited voice came from outside the study door, but then a cold voice followed. Sorry, Master Renly. Lord Stannis doesn't want to see anyone right now. A guard guarding outside the study stopped Renly Baratheon, the third young master of Storm's End. The boy in the blue velvet shirt seemed to have a basin of cold water poured on his head, and a shiny stone in his hand accidentally fell to the ground. For some reason, the third young master of Storm's End was slightly different from other boys of the same age. Although he also received some relatively easy knight training, he was actually not interested in wielding swords and guns. Renly preferred to collect some beautiful things. For example, he had just followed a few friends to the beach to pick up some beautiful stones, and this shiny stone was his favorite. However, because the storm surge was about to come, several children were driven back before they had fun. So after returning to the castle, Renly took the stone and wanted to share it with his brother Stannis. However, he didn't expect that the boy who ran over excitedly was directly rejected. Renly's mood instantly dropped, and he pouted his lips slightly in frustration. He picked up his beloved beautiful stone from the ground and was about to leave. Stannis in the study heard the whole conversation outside, frowned slightly, and finally spoke in a calm voice. Renly, let him in. In fact, he still cared about his younger brother. Their parents, Duke Stephen Baratheon and Duchess Cassandra Esmond, died in an accident in Shipwreck Bay, leaving only a young brother. The eldest brother Robert had an unruly personality, while the calm and experienced second brother Stannis played the role of a strict father. However, Stannis was not good at expressing his feelings. When he heard that his brother allowed him to enter the study, the black-haired boy immediately wiped away the frustration on his face and smiled. However, at this moment, dang, a melodious alarm bell suddenly came from the direction of the distant lighthouse. Stannis, who was sitting in the study, was slightly stunned, and a look of surprise appeared on his old-fashioned face. The guards and Renly who were guarding outside the study were also stunned. This voice was too familiar. It awakened the memory hidden in Renly's heart that had not yet disappeared. Just half a year ago, they were trapped in Storm's End and eating mice, and the sound of horns and bells came from outside every now and then. Master Renly, who was only 5 years old, was frightened and cried on the spot, and the scene was suddenly in chaos. The whole Storm's End was not much better. The painful memory of half a year ago seemed to still be in front of them. The soldiers ran around in a hurry, and the servants in the castle were in a mess. Stannis was the calmest among them. After the shock just now, the man with a firm face quickly calmed down. Then he immediately stood up from the chair and pushed open the door of the study without even looking at Renly, who was sitting on the ground and crying in fear. Holding the hilt with one hand, he strode outside with a gloomy face. Seven hells. Can anyone tell me what happened? At this moment, a soldier finally ran over in a panic and told Stannis what happened. Lord Stannis, something bad has happened. The soldier ran out of breath and seemed to have run from the watchtower in one breath. At this moment, his face was full of panic. A large number of unidentified ships appeared on the sea, and now they are riding the storm to attack the port. Chapter 38 A Fire in the Storm. Not far away, on the sea of Shipbreaker Bay, the Dragonstone fleet came in a storm. The bad weather hindered their progress, but also obscured their whereabouts. Crash, the warship broke through the wind and waves, and hid in the storm, while the heavy rain was still pouring down, and the big raindrops hit the deck with a crackling sound. The sky was gloomy and terrible, and countless warships on the sea surface lined up neatly, and passed through the fog. They appeared and disappeared like ghosts, as if they emerged from under the sea, looming, as if they appeared out of thin air in the vision of the sentinels of Storm's End. The soldiers of the Baratheon family stood on the watchtower and rubbed their eyes hard, watching the huge fleet hidden in the storm approaching quickly. This is. He even couldn't believe his eyes, and then after reacting, he hurriedly rang the alarm bell. However, it was too late. The fleet had already ridden the wind and waves and headed straight for the port of Storm's End. Storm's End is one of the strongest castles in the Seven Kingdoms. The castle is surrounded by a thick outer wall. The thickest part is about 100 feet high and 40 feet thick. The side facing the sea is about 80 feet thick. It is extremely strong. The wall is composed of 2 layers of rock and a sandwich of sand and gravel. The wall is smooth and curved, and the stones are so compact that not even a breeze can get in. There is even a legend that Storm's End was built by the ancient Storm King using magic to withstand the harsh climate of Shipbreaker Bay. In fact, Storm's End itself does not have a port. There is a cliff facing the sea. There is only one waterway leading to the interior of Storm's End, but it is blocked by a fence gate. The port of Storm's End was built for Stannis to train the Royal Navy. Because of its advantageous geographical location and deep water near the coast, it is not difficult to build a port for Storm's End. Not far from the castle is where the Royal Navy is stored today. And now, all the newly launched Royal Navy warships were huddled in the harbor, with ropes fixed and cloths covered, making full preparations to resist the storm. Stannis had lived in Storm's End since he was a child, so he was naturally very familiar with the bad weather in Shipbreaker Bay. In addition, he had received a warning from the Citadel not long ago that the east coast of Westeros was about to usher in an unprecedented huge storm. Although Shipbreaker Bay was not the center of this storm, the impact was not great, perhaps just a rainstorm. But the cautious man was still fully prepared. So Stannis had long ago ordered all warships not to leave the port. The Navy's training plan was temporarily shelved, and all soldiers stayed in the barracks and were not allowed to board the ship. Therefore, before this storm came, there was not even a sampan in the sea area near Storm's End, so naturally it was impossible to find the Targaryen fleet that was quietly attacking. Now the Targaryen fleet is hidden in the storm that has just started, riding the wind and waves straight to the port of Storm's End. Although the fleet also suffered some losses in the storm, these losses are still within an acceptable range. After all, the straight line distance from here to the center of the storm in Blackwater Bay is more than 600 nautical miles, and this is just the edge of the storm. It was only because the storm kept moving that Storm's End was also affected by the disaster. The Targaryen fleet came suddenly, like a divine soldier descending from the sky, catching the soldiers of the Baratheon family off guard. No one would have thought that the Targaryen fleet would come in the storm. The Royal Navy of Storm's End did not even have a sampan to go to sea, and was completely in a state of no defense. Then this fleet, which had just taken shape, and had not even fought a battle, suffered a devastating and heavy blow. Boom boom boom, the catapult on the fleet's flagship Black Death roared, and the stone bullets broke through the air with a dull sound, and directly bombarded the Baratheon fleet that was densely packed together, and huddled in the port in the distance. There were even many stone bombs wrapped in kerosene cloth and then ignited. The kerosene would not be extinguished by the violent rain, and the flying kerosene stone bombs hit the warships of the Baratheon fleet fiercely. If they were fighting in formation on the sea, perhaps these large-scale siege weapons would not be so accurate, but now the Baratheon fleet is all densely huddled in the port. They were even fixed to the shore with ropes and anchors, and the ships were tightly squeezed together. The ropes also connected the warships together to prevent them from being scattered and colliding with each other in the storm and suffering serious losses. Originally, Stannis' order was understandable, because this was indeed the best way to resist the storm. The warships had no way to be pushed ashore or lifted into the castle, so they could only use their hard bodies to withstand the wind and waves. Fixing the ships together could effectively increase the damage to the storm. But now that they were attacked, the connected warships became live targets for the Targaryen fleet. The soldiers in charge of mangonels and crossbows didn't even need to aim, they just needed to pull the rope to throw the stone bullets to hit the target. Boom boom boom, the newly built royal fleet of the Baratheon family wailed in the storm. The stone bullets smashed through the deck, the kerosene with billowing black smoke ignited the covering cloth, and then ignited the warships in the storm. Whoosh, the flames that rose with the wind spread in the cabin under the deck. The flames gradually rose, the fire snakes danced, and ignited the stored food and grass in the cabin. The pillars supporting the deck were engulfed in the fire, and then collapsed with a bang. The whole warship was wrapped in red flames, and then finally separated from the sea and gradually sank. However, more warships were hit by kerosene stone bullets, and even later the Targaryen fleet directly launched kerosene barrels through the trebuchet, which further fueled the fire. In an instant, a port not far from Storm's End, a huge fire was blazing in the rainstorm. The Baratheon family's fleet was completely engulfed in flames. Thick black smoke rushed straight into the sky, and the flames illuminated the entire sky red. In the distance, on the second deck of the Black Death, Viserys stood in the rainstorm and wind, and did not shrink into the cabin, because he wanted to feel the real war more intuitively. As a result, the boy was drenched, and his long silver gold hair stuck to his fair face, and water droplets kept sliding down his cheeks. However, Viserys' pair of lavender eyes were particularly bright, and the sea of fire in the distance was reflected in his eyes. This fire burned away the usurper's ambition to invade Dragonstone in the next 5 years. Chapter 39, Storm. This fire has burned away the usurper's ambition to invade Dragonstone in the next 5 years. The old knight standing next to the boy coughed lightly and then spoke. Viserys turned his head slightly and glanced at the little old man standing next to him. He didn't know where the other party's 5-year data came from and whether there was any evidence to support it. But he also understood that this fire did make Dragonstone temporarily safe. The usurper's war is not over yet, and the fat man of Baratheon, oh no, the future fat man, his throne is not so stable. The usurper's war has taken a sharp turn for the worse since his brother Rhaegar died in the war. The Targaryens have not won a single battle and have suffered successive defeats and finally lost the Iron Throne. Now Viserys' fire has lit a bright light for the Targaryen family in the long night ahead, at least slightly boosting the morale that is now extremely depressed. However, in fact, this fire has little to do with Viserys. In fact, his most fundamental purpose was just to rely on the advantage of foresight and not want the Dragonstone fleet to be buried in the storm. So he wanted the fleet to escape from the storm vortex of Dragonstone. However, he did not expect that the almost bold suggestion given by a child would be adopted by mistake. Sir Geoffrey finally decided to race against the storm and raid Storm's End. Then, without Stannis' expectation, the Targaryen fleet sailed out of the storm. It caught him off guard and blocked the Baratheon fleet in the port, and a big fire completely burned it. The future is even destined to become one of the most classic cases in the history of Westeros naval battles. However, Viserys actually just gave a suggestion, which played a minimal role. The subsequent command, combat, and raid had nothing to do with him. He just stood beside the old man and blew the sea breeze and got caught in a heavy rain. Although Viserys took the initiative to stand outside to watch the battle, I don't know why the old knight did not drive the troublesome child back. Instead, he took the initiative to bring him with him, and even when the war meeting was held, Viserys stood aside to listen. On the top of Storm's End, Stannis held the cold battlement with his hands, his face tense, his body straight, and his broad shoulders bearing the mountain. At this time, his whole body was soaked by the rain, and his heart was as cold as the rain. The young heir to the Iron Throne looked at the fire rising to the sky in the distant port, clenched his fists, and his 5 fingers actually scratched out a thin layer of stone powder on the cold and hard battlement. His fingers were also worn unconsciously, and the white marks on the bricks were stained with blood. However, at this moment, Stannis was no longer concerned about the pain. He only felt that his breathing was slightly rapid, his chest kept rising and falling violently, and then his vision in front of him gradually blurred, and could not see clearly. Then the world spun. "My lord!" the guards around him exclaimed. Then they hurriedly hugged Stannis to prevent him from fainting and falling under the wall. Otherwise, if Stannis lost his footing and fell from the 100-foot high wall of Storm's End, he would be doomed. It would be a joke if the king's brother, the heir to the Iron Throne, fell off the wall and died. "Where's Maester Cresson? Quickly find the Maester!" The guards shouted loudly while holding Stannis, who had fainted. Then other soldiers hurried into the castle to find Maester Cresson, who served the Baratheon family. At the same time, on the distant Dragonstone Island, the outside world was a terrible scene like the end of the world. The gloomy sky and thick dark clouds almost pressed down on the ground, and the strong wind was mixed with heavy rain. The big rain poured down and hit the sturdy castle. The dragon on Dragonstone Island roared to the sky, as if it was fighting against this terrible disaster. As the center of this unprecedented huge storm surge in Westeros, Dragonstone Island stands tall above the turbulent sea, allowing the terrible waves to hit the cliffs, making a huge roar. The sky was gloomy and terrible, and the waves became manic and arrogant. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the giant dragon that stood still in the raging waves. In an instant, the sky and the earth were bright. Crack, and thunder sounded. Rumble. The outside world was like the end of the world, and the stone drum tower was on high alert. Quick! Stop the water here! Almost all the soldiers of Dragonstone Island were concentrated in the castle, and they were highly nervous to drain the flood and resist the disaster. The former Red Castle coach put on armor again after more than half a year, holding the hilt of the sword with one hand, and personally guarded outside the gate, but his face was slightly ugly. The bad weather triggered his old wounds. The old wounds, that had almost been pierced through his abdomen by a sword, were itchy and painful in such thunderstorms, just like countless ants gnawing on them. It was almost unbearable. As the acting Lord of Dragonstone appointed by Rhaegar, Sir Shat, the bastard from Dawn, also appeared outside the door. He sat side by side with Sir William, his eyes a little erratic. Everyone was very nervous. Because the pregnant Queen Rhaegar finally responded today, she hurriedly found a midwife and several maids to help. Now Her Majesty is giving birth in the house. In the house, the lightning, thunder, wind, and rain outside undoubtedly affected the mood of the parturient. The long silver hair was scattered on the bed, and Queen Rhaegar's consciousness was gradually becoming a little blurred. The woman opened her legs and tried her best to give birth to her child, but not everything in the world would be smooth sailing. Giving birth is undoubtedly one of the most difficult things for a woman. Quick! Stop the bleeding! The inexperienced midwife and the queen's maid in the house were busy helping the queen give birth. However, the blood under the queen's body seemed to flow unstoppably. In addition, Queen Rhaegar was already an elderly mother who had become a grandmother. Even though Viserys had always urged her to exercise more, the woman's body could no longer withstand such torture. In the end, she gave up resistance. Jonah. The woman's consciousness was completely blurred, her will collapsed, and she no longer resisted. Her dry lips slightly opened, and she recited the names of the past. Bonifer, Ares. Rhaegar seemed to see her entire life in front of her eyes, which was being replayed quickly. Rhaegar. Viserys. My children. A crystal tear fell from the corner of her eye. Chapter 40. Daenerys Targaryen. Queen Rhaegar had suffered several blows and her mental illness was difficult to heal. Her spirit was on the verge of collapse, and she even had the signs of madness. There is no greater sorrow than a dead heart. When the silver-haired woman herself had given up the desire to live, even the seven gods could not save the queen, who was in trouble. In the end, Rhaegar Targaryen was conscious and kept repeating the names she had just read out, the most important people in her short life. Her female companion Jonah, her first love Bonifer, her brother and husband Ares, her eldest son Rhaegar, and her second son Viserys. Then she finally took her last breath on the sickbed. Queen Rhaegar still had a brief period of lucidity before she died. She seemed to understand that she was about to leave this world. She hugged her little daughter who took her life with tears in her hands and gave her a nice name. Daenerys Targaryen. The baby girl in the cradle closed her eyes tightly, her face was wrinkled and did not look very good, and her silver hair was close to her scalp. She was born in this storm, then curled up and finally cried loudly. At the same time, boom, or thunder suddenly exploded in the sky above Dragonstone. Lightning illuminated the entire sky, and heavy rain poured down. I don't know how many people were startled, and the things in the hands of the instructor sitting outside the door fell to the ground. Then he hurriedly bent down to pick it up. This is a human-shaped puppet he carved on a small wooden block with a dagger. When he was free, it can be vaguely seen that it is a woman, but there are no facial features to see the specific identity. In the distance, King's Landing. A black raven flew through the blue sky without any dust, overlooking the huge city below. tilted its head slightly, and the high-speed airflow on both sides drove its feathers flutter. Then the raven flapped its wings to lower its altitude, and finally flew to the red castle on Egan's Hill in King's Landing. With his messy grey beard ruffled in the wind, Grand Maester Purcell looked extremely old, and his legs and feet were a little stiff as he walked over tremblingly. He casually threw a snack to the raven, and then took the letter from the raven's leg. Grand Maester Purcell unfolded the letter, took a quick look at it, and saw the contents clearly, and then his face suddenly changed. Then his legs and feet seemed to have improved, and he immediately gathered up his robes, and walked quickly to Migo's holdfast. The maids who passed by saw this scene, that symbolized a medical miracle, and they all stood there in a daze. This was a letter from Storm's End, and it brought bad news. Stannis was ordered to supervise the construction of the royal fleet. When it was resting at Storm's End, to prepare for the storm, it was attacked by the Targaryen fleet. The other side unexpectedly took advantage of the storm, and launched an attack from the sea, creating a classic example of a nearly perfect naval battle. They were bold, careful, and courageous, willing to bear the losses brought by the storm, and destroy the Baratheon fleet in one fell swoop. Stannis had never expected that the Targaryen family's fleet would suddenly appear on the Sea of Shipbreaker Bay like a god, and the storm that frightened all the fleets concealed the whereabouts of the other side. The result of this battle was that the royal fleet that the Iron Throne spent a huge price to build and had great expectations was directly buried in the sea. Grand Maester Purcell naturally knew the seriousness of the matter, because he betrayed the Targaryen family. If the Targaryen family came back one day, I'm afraid he would be the first to die. And this old man didn't want to die. So the fearful Grand Maester didn't bother to pretend to be staggering. Instead, he hurried to Meager's tower to report the matter to the new King Robert Baratheon. What? The young king, who was drinking happily in the king's bedroom and Meager's holdfast, was shocked to hear the news. Then he stood up and snatched the letter from Grand Maester Purcell and looked it up and down. The atmosphere in the king's bedroom was slightly frozen. The waiter standing next to Robert and responsible for pouring wine, and Purcell, who accidentally fell to the ground after the letter was snatched away, were all shocked and dared not speak. Because anyone could feel the anger brewing in King Robert's heart. The young and strong king stood up like a mountain, with thick black hair and beard ruffling, and a pair of eyes spewing anger. He was pacing back and forth in the spacious king's bedroom. Then he kicked over the square table in front of him without warning. Boom. The wine cups, books and various news about King's Landing on the table were scattered on the ground. The waiter holding the wine pot and Grand Maester Purcell were both frightened. The grey-haired old man sat on the ground and his face was pale for a long time without getting up. Your Majesty, the captain of the King's Guard, Ser Barristan the Fearless, who was guarding the door, was slightly startled when he heard the noise inside the room. Then he hurriedly pushed the door open and walked in, and then he saw King Robert, who was roaring, "Seven hells! Stannis, you rubbish!" King Robert's thunderous roar resounded in the king's bedroom, shaking people's eardrums slightly, and even the corridor outside the door could hear it clearly. "Even if I send a dog as commander, I will not let the royal fleet be wiped out. I should do this. At least the dog will not let the warships be connected together and burned by the damn enemy." Robert Baratheon was furious, and he hated his second brother, who he didn't like, because of his personality even more. Originally, he thought that, although Stannis was old-fashioned and stubborn, he still had some skills in fighting. In addition, based on the trust in his brother, he gave him such an important task, but he didn't expect Stannis to mess up the matter. He could not bear for a moment that the bastard of the dragon could continue to live in this world. Only he could deeply feel the hatred for the Targaryen family. However, he did not expect that he had spent such a huge price, invested a nearly bottomless pit of gold and dragons, and even went to Casterly Rock and the Iron Bank for loans, but only got such a result. The bastard of the dragon not only did not die, but jumped on his face and shit. And Ser Barristan, who was wearing a white robe, did not say a word, but just bent down slightly, picked up the handwritten letter from Stannis that was thrown on the ground, and then looked up and down. He saw the whole story clearly, and then froze in place. Chapter 41 Prime Minister. He had never thought that the Targaryen family would be able to complete a desperate counter-attack in such a dire situation. Ser Barristan the Fearless had thought that the Targaryen family was doomed. He was loyal to the Iron Throne and had even wanted to die for the Targaryen dynasty. But he had never expected that his bravery would impress Robert Baratheon, so he pardoned his crime and asked Barristan Selmy to become the new king's captain of the King's Guard. The White Knight now held the hilt of his sword with one hand, looking at the table that had been kicked over, the spilled wine, the documents stuck to the wine, and scattered all over the floor, the trembling maesters and waiters, and the new king who was furious. His beard and hair were ruffled like steel wool, and his tall and strong body was covered with a cloak, like a crazy brown bear. Furious, he kept smashing the items in the room, making loud noises that could be heard clearly outside the hall. Looking around, all he could see was a mess. However, the white-robed knight quietly watched everything in front of him, holding the hilt of his sword with one hand, without saying a word, or trying to persuade the king to calm down. The crow's feet at the corners of the knight's eyes were a little deep, and his light blue eyes were deep. Then he lowered his head, and looked at the floor under his feet. He sighed softly and couldn't help but fall into memories. This scene. He felt a little familiar. Another king he had served, the previous owner of this room, Aerys Targaryen II, who was called the Mad King, often got angry in this room. Then he smashed the place into a mess, and even ordered that all those who angered him be burned to death with wildfire, because he liked to hear the torture. Barristan thought that the era of Targaryen was over, and the Mad King Aerys II had died under the sword of the Kingslayer, and he might never see this scene again from then on. However, he didn't expect that in just over half a year, he would see such a familiar scene again. Sir Barristan Selmy the Fearless. At this moment, King Robert, who was pacing and smashing things in a rage, suddenly stopped. He then raised his head and looked at the captain of the King's Guard who was standing at the door, holding Stannis' handwritten letter in one hand and thinking. The king's voice was low and powerful. Although it seemed that Robert had controlled his temper on the surface, the infinite anger could still be heard in this irritable voice. However, unlike the Mad King, Robert would not vent his anger on irrelevant people. He would not burn people alive for fun. Your Majesty. After hearing King Robert's voice, Sir Barristan came back to his senses and put down Stannis' handwritten letter in his hand. Then he raised his head and looked directly at the king without any deviation. Go to the tower of the Prime Minister and invite Lord Jon Arryn to come here. I have something very important to discuss with him. King Robert's voice was loud and deafening, and his voice was like the bells of the cathedral. He seemed to have made a very important decision in his heart, and then he couldn't wait to find his adoptive father, Lord Jon Arryn, the Duke of the Eyrie and now the Prime Minister, to give him some advice. Robert relied on this old duke very much, because this old man was brave, upright, and wise. If the old duke had not bravely spread his wings to protect his two adopted sons before the start of the War of the Usurper, but had succumbed to the Mad King, Robert and Eddard would have become a pile of dry bones by now. There would be no King Robert and Duke Eddard Stark today. So Robert respected and relied on the old duke very much, and he would refer to his opinions, no matter what decision he made. In the words of Eddard Stark, perhaps only Jon Arryn in this world can control Robert. Even Robert's dead biological parents can't make this bastard change his evil ways. However, the White Knight frowned slightly when he heard the king's words, but stood still. Go. Robert saw that Barristan did not immediately execute his order, and his anger surged up again. His eyes stared at the White Knight and then asked. However, Sir Barristan remained unmoved, and his eyes quietly looked at the king who was still furious, like an angry brown bear. Then he sighed slightly, and spoke in a calm voice. Your Majesty, have you forgotten that the Prime Minister has been away from King's Landing for more than a month? The Baratheon dynasty was established, but the Seven Kingdoms were not unified. Dorne did not submit to the new king, and even the Greyjoy family of the Iron Islands did not take the initiative to come to King's Landing to express their submission. And now, as the Prime Minister, the old Duke worked hard to clean up the pain caused by the war that lasted more than 2 years and swept across the entire Westeros continent. The whole country has gone through the period of the new king's coronation and finally got on the right track, but it has not yet returned to the state on the eve of the Targaryen dynasty war. The problem of Dorne has always been a thorn in the throat and has become a problem that the new dynasty must solve. So more than a month ago, the old duke finally made enough preparations and took the body of Prince Luenmal to Dorne for peace negotiations. trying to calm the anger of Dawn caused by the death of Prince Lewin, Eliamalt and his son Ekin. However, what Sir Barristan Selmy did not expect was that the old Duke still travelled thousands of miles to Dawn for the unification of the country at such an old age. But the king, who sat in King's Landing and enjoyed himself all day, forgot about this matter or never remembered it at all. Ever since Lord John Arryn left King's Landing, the king has been indulging himself in eating, drinking, whoring, and gambling, and has not paid any attention to state affairs. All of them are piled up waiting for the old Duke to come back and deal with them. Lord John Arryn has left King's Landing? Hearing the blunt words of the White Knight, King Robert's slightly fat face was clearly full of surprise, and the anger just now was reduced a lot because of this interruption. He really couldn't remember this matter, but after hearing what Barristan said, he seemed to have a little impression. So that's it. King Robert suddenly realized. No wonder the old man didn't come to persuade him not to just eat and whore to his heart's content during this period of time. It turned out that he had left King's Landing and went to Dawn. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 42 Quarrel. Since the Prime Minister has left King's Landing, there is no need to bother him with this matter. The slightly fat king choked a little, but then shook his head and continued to speak. He turned his head and looked at Grand Maester Purcell, who was sitting on the ground and groaning, and his eyes glared slightly. Pretentious. Get up quickly. Although Robert Baratheon took off his armor and sat on the Iron Throne for only half a year, his body swelled up quickly like a balloon. However, the rapidly accumulated fat could not eliminate his once strong muscles, but only temporarily covered them under the fat. Even after gaining weight, King Robert was even more majestic than when he was fighting on the battlefield. Just by glaring at Grand Maester Purcell, who was sitting on the ground holding his legs and pretending to be pretentious, he trembled all over and quickly got up from the ground. Your Majesty, send a letter quickly and summon all the vassals. I will personally attack Dragonstone. King Robert roared. He could not tolerate the Targaryen continuing to live in the world. He originally thought that it would be easy to sail across Blackwater Bay and capture Dragonstone after the royal fleet was built. After all, the newly built royal fleet invested in the nearly bottomless Golden Dragon. In order to consolidate the sea border, Robert Baratheon's fleet construction was expected to be the largest fleet in the entire Westeros continent. Even the comprehensive strength has exceeded the strongest Iron Fleet in the past. The size, tonnage, and number of soldiers of the fleet built by the Baratheon family are all far above the Dragonstone fleet, not to mention that many of the warships in this Targaryen fleet stationed on Dragonstone are already old and dilapidated. Although the tactics and soldiers' quality of naval warfare are also critical, the strength of the warship is relatively more important. If the ship is large enough and strong enough, it can be invincible, relying on hard power. The result of such a fleet with huge investment and stronger strength meeting an outdated fleet is obvious. But Stannis buried the royal fleet in the sea. Robert felt deeply threatened in anger. I don't know why. Robert, who has been sitting on the Iron Throne for only half a year, has changed significantly from the brave and fearless Duke of Storm's End. Not only in size. Now Robert roared angrily and demanded to summon all the nobles loyal to him to attack Dragonstone. When Grand Maester Purcell, with grey hair and beard, heard King Robert's words, he stood there in a daze. Although everyone in the Red Castle knew that the king had a bold and unrestrained personality, or in other words, impulsive and reckless, he did not expect King Robert to be so crazy. A small Dragonstone island with a harsh environment and a sparse population is just a small fishing village. Is such a small island worth King Robert's money and effort to gather all his vassals to attack? Your Majesty, Grand Maester Purcell was a little flustered, his lips trembling, and he wanted to persuade him. At this time, the captain of the King's Guard, who had been silent, suddenly spoke. Your Majesty. Sir Barristan Selmy held the hilt of his sword with one hand, his pure white cloak hanging on the ground, and he frowned slightly as he looked into the king's eyes. It was just a pair of orphans and a widow who fled to Dragonstone. They can't pose any threat to your position. Now the continent of Westeros, from the Great Wall to the south, is almost in Robert's hands. Prime Minister Jon Arryn also went to appease Dawn. I believe that the Seven Kingdoms will be unified soon. The orphans and widows on Dragonstone have no one to rely on, no resources, and only a broken fleet, which can't threaten the safety of Westeros at all. You don't need to start a war for a child and a woman who are powerless. This will damage your honor. Although he now serves Baratheon, he has never told anyone that he once swore that if he saw Robert smiling when Tywin Lannister showed the body of Rhaegar's child, he would definitely not be loyal to Robert. Moreover, nothing in this world can stop him from killing Robert. Not harming women and children is the honor and bottom line that Barristan Selmy abides by as a knight. However, Barristan's words were like the fuse that ignited the gunpowder barrel, instantly igniting King Robert's anger. I didn't make it clear to you before, so I'll say it again now. Lord Barristan Selmy, I want them to die. They die together. I don't want to see any evil dragon's offspring continue to live in this world. The angry King Robert was like a furious brown bear, with hard hair ruffling and saliva spurting out from a distance, staring at Barristan, hoping to scare him with his momentum. However, the White Knight's eyes were slightly furrowed, and he was not scared away by the king's momentum. Still looking into his eyes, Grand Maester Pycelle was frightened by the situation, and hurriedly trembled to persuade him. Your Majesty, the Seven Kingdoms are all under your feet. You can easily gather countless knights, but the knights' horses cannot swim across the sea. The white-haired Grand Maester stood on the side of the captain of the King's Guard, but he did not do it for honor, thinking that women and children should not be cut. He actually did not object to killing Queen Rhaenyra and Prince Viserys to eliminate future troubles. He even received news that Viserys had been crowned on Dragonstone. But in his opinion, King Robert was making a fuss. And there is another important issue at the moment, which has been discussed before, that is, the Baratheon dynasty has no fleet now, so it has spent a lot of effort to build a fleet. Now with the destruction of the newly built royal fleet, Baratheon has temporarily lost its extravagant hope for the sea. Grand Maester Pycelle spoke in a trembling voice. Lord Redwyne's fleet has suffered losses, and has now returned to the Arbiter Rest. As for the Iron Fleet, you seem to have forgotten that Balon Greyjoy of the Iron Islands has not yet come to King's Landing to submit to you. Grand Maester Pycelle said, while looking at King Robert's face. He tried his best to use euphemisms to avoid angering him. Then he told him about the current situation. Now King Robert has no fleet that can fight. The sea is where the remnants of the Targaryen can come and go freely. And the next day, the news that the royal fleet was destroyed in the port has spread throughout King's Landing. In an instant, it was like a thunderclap. Everyone was saying that the Targaryen would make a comeback. And in the distance, Viserys and the victorious Dragonstone fleet have also set out on their way home. Crash, cutting through the waves and heading into the distance. Chapter 43 Return. Crash, the warship broke through the calm sea and sailed quietly under the afternoon sun. The sea after the storm was as quiet as a dignified girl. The mirror-like sea surface reflected the golden sunshine, and the gentle sea breeze gently brushed the boy's cheek like a girl's bare hand. Viserys still stood on the highest deck of the Black Death, facing the sea breeze, and feeling the gentle touch. His silver golden curly hair fluttered in the wind, and his cute little face was full of peace. This was the first time, since he came to this world, that he slightly let go of some of the heart that had been hanging. Unlike the old Maester's guidance before, this time Viserys really felt that the sense of crisis that had been like a thorn in his back was temporarily relieved. At least after this battle, the threat in front of him was temporarily lifted, allowing him to breathe a sigh of relief and have more breathing space. We are almost at Dragonstone. At this time, cheers came from the soldiers on the deck below. It turned out that they saw the familiar island and realized that they were not far from home. In fact, there are not many people from Dragonstone among the soldiers of this fleet. They are mainly from the royal territory near King's Landing, and most of the soldiers are recruited here. Some even come from other regions, such as the Westerlands, Highgarden, Stormlands, etc., including some mercenaries from the East Continent across the Narrow Sea. For these soldiers, the concept of home has long been blurred. They are all poor people. In such an era, it is almost difficult to get ahead, unless they are nobles. Being tall and strong enough to be a soldier is already a good way out. At least they can rob others without worrying that bandits dare to attack them. For example, in King's Landing, if you want to be a gold cloak, you not only have physical fitness requirements, but also need to spend a lot of money to bribe the recruiting officer, which is not cheap for civilians. Now the soldiers are cheering for finally returning to Dragonston. This time the war has been successfully survived, and living on the ship for a long time will also make people numb, and they are eager to return to land. And Viserys was actually a little excited in his heart, and this was clearly revealed in his beautiful lavender eyes. Then the silver-haired boy held the railing with his hand, and turned his head to look to the other side. According to the navigation chart, the fleet is passing from one side of the sharp corner, and passing through the throat, which is one of the main shipping channels between the East Continent and Westeros. Is that Tidehead Island over there? Viserys stood on the deck, holding the railing with his tender little hands, looking at the outline of the island appearing on the sea level in the distance. Then he turned around, and asked the soldiers around him with some curiosity. "Yes, your highness." A black-haired soldier wearing leather armor, and hanging a long sword around his waist, with a slightly fat face, and a naive look, nodded quickly. Now the old knight is resting in the cabin, and following Viserys is a clerk who is responsible for handling documents. The old knight replaced the previous guards, and now this slightly fat clerk is responsible for protecting Viserys' safety, and answering some questions for Viserys. I don't know what considerations the old knight made for this arrangement. Maybe the guards at the time were incompetent, or maybe Viserys really had a lot of problems. Now the outline of an island appears in the fleet's field of vision, and the soldiers cheered, because they saw this. Before setting off, due to the coming storm, visibility on the sea was very low, and Viserys did not see the island that was so close. But he also knew the other side's name. Tidehead Island. Tidehead Island should have been a vassal of the Duke of Dragonston. The owner of this island is the Valerian family, who also has Valyrian blood. They used to have a close relationship with the Targaryen family and frequently intermarried, but this relationship did not continue after Aegon III. The Valerian family was also one of the overlords on the sea in Westeros in the past, but it suffered a heavy blow during the Dance of the Dragons and eventually gradually declined. These were all explained to Viserys by the former Maester Daniel. The old Maester asked Viserys to read the family history of each family and remember their family emblems and mottos. But now, the Valerian family did not surrender to the usurper on the surface, but at the same time, rejected the call of Dragonston Island, and seemed to be watching from the sidelines. Viserys remembered that, when he and his mother first arrived at Dragonston, Queen Rhaella had summoned all the vassals of Dragonston, but in fact no one responded to Queen Rhaella's call. Although Tidehead Island was very close to Dragonston, it did not respond at all, as if it did not hear or see it. Viserys certainly understood the choice of this distant relative, but while expressing his understanding, he must also be careful of the possible betrayal of this neighbor. Valyrian also has a fleet. At this time, a voice came from behind Viserys and the steward. The old knight came out of the cabin. He heard the conversation between the two people, and the two people on the deck turned their heads. Morford Valerian is also a warlike man. Sir Jeffrey's grey hair fluttered, and there were some age spots on his vicissitudes of life. He held his belt with one hand, and looked into the distance. But it's a pity that the fleet may have been buried in the sea, and Earl Morford has also lost his courage. Viserys could hear the faint sarcasm in the old man's mouth. He was slightly curious, but did not ask in depth. This unprecedented storm destroyed any ship that appeared in this sea area, even a piece of wood, and even many islands were submerged by that tsunami. The old lord's words also told Viserys not to worry about the Valerian family. He seemed to hear something in Viserys' words. The Targaryen fleet passed by Tidehead Island, but did not land or say hello, but it made the people on the island terrified. Viserys stood on the deck at the closest place to the island and finally saw the panicked figures of the frightened people on the castle. The crowd seemed to be looking in this direction. They were afraid that the Targaryen fleet would plunder Tidehead Island because of their previous silence. However, Sir Geoffrey and Viserys had no such intention. The fleet passed by Tidehead Island so close. In fact, it was just a warning to the people on the island with ulterior motives with the power of victory. It is better to make a careful choice. Then the Targaryen fleet sailed away. Tidehead Island is very close to Dragonstone Island, even less than 30 nautical miles, less than half a day. As the sun set, the fleet finally broke through the red clouds on the sea and returned to Dragonstone. Chapter 44 Crying. The return of the fleet from the expedition naturally caused a sensation on Dragonstone. In fact, on the way back, the news of this great victory had spread along with the wings of ravens. First, it was a big fuss in King's Landing. When there are too many people, problems are easy to occur. King's Landing has a dense and complicated population, so the news naturally spreads very quickly. The Gold Cloaks have not been idle for a few days, and they are once again in a mess to arrest people everywhere. Then the news began to spread from King's Landing, brought by merchant ships that stopped at Dragonstone 4S between the two continents, even faster than the Targaryen fleet. The Targaryen fleet destroyed all the Baratheon ships in the Battle of Shipbreaker Bay, but the rumor fermented into several other unreliable versions after word of mouth. The first is that the Targaryen royal family awakened the sleeping Valyrian Dragon King on Dragonstone, and there are also claims that they dug up the treasure left by their ancestors. As for the last one, it is even more magical. It is rumored that the little Prince Viserys awakened the bone dragon in the blood sacrifice on Dragonstone, and then personally drove the dragon to reenact the war in which Gian conquered Westeros and burned down Storm's End. However, there are many rumors, and the most credible one is that Viserys really stood in front of everyone. The fleet sailed into the port and finally docked and fixed the ship after some twists and turns. Viserys stood at the bow and many soldiers were waiting to get off the ship. His silver gold and long hair fluttered, and the boy still looked heroic in leather armor. A pair of lavender eyes looked into the distance, and then lowered his head to look at the crowd below. As the center of the storm, Dragonstone was naturally hit very hard. Now within Viserys' sight, Dragonstone seemed to have made a big change from what he remembered. The trees were torn, the land was rolling and muddy, and the bare island now looked more rugged, as if it had been ruthlessly ravaged. The volcano in the distance was still emitting billowing white smoke, and it seemed that many rocks had fallen down due to landslides. The small fishing village not far from the port was severely impacted by the landslides. Many of the rocks that were washed down still stayed in the village, destroying the houses and the pitiful little arable land. In the small fishing village, Viserys also saw many families hanging white cloths, which seemed to indicate that some family members had died in this storm. This small fishing village is the only source of population on Dragonstone. Their lives also depend on fishing at the port of Dragonstone, but now the former port has been shattered, and some wooden boards are still floating on the sea. Viserys retracted his gaze and looked down. He could see that there were still soldiers stepping up repairs, shouting loudly to cooperate with the ropes pulled from above, to try to dock the warships on the shore. And in the welcoming crowd below, Sir Shad, the acting steward and Lord of Dragonstone, looked a little ugly at this moment for some reason. Next to him was Sir William Derry, the former headmaster of the Red Keep, who risked his life to protect Rhaela and her son. The two of them stood in the front, and the headmaster was holding the little girl Rhaenys by his side, and behind them were servants and soldiers. Viserys stood on the boat and looked down for a few times, followed behind Sir Geoffrey and surrounded by a group of soldiers, and walked down the Black Death together. Tap tap, footsteps stepped on the wooden gangway, one step at a time. Viserys walked down from the warship, and the people who were waiting at the port below saw the silver-haired boy walk down from the warship, and they knelt down without saying a word. Viserys, who was walking down, holding the makeshift broken wooden gangway, was slightly stunned when he saw this scene. He didn't know what was going on, and why everyone was doing this. However, just as he was about to ask, he was interrupted by Rhaenys, who broke free from the hand of the headmaster and ran over. The little girl with brown hair hugged Viserys tightly, tears bursting out instantly, while Viserys hugged Rhaenys, felt his shoulders wet by the girl's tears, and had a bad feeling in his heart. Rhaenys, as the sun set, the boy half knelt on the ground and hugged Rhaenys, pursing his dry lips slightly. Then he opened his mouth again, as if he wanted to say something but stopped. But in the end he chose not to ask. It was already evening when the fleet arrived at Dragonstone. The time spent on loading and unloading the spoils of war, coupled with the severe damage to the port caused by the storm, and now the warships could only be fixed before they could disembark, had already completely dockened. A group of people walked on the rugged and winding mountain road, with torches lighting the way ahead. Tat, the fully armed guards on both sides protected their little king, holding torches high in their hands, and the blazing flames danced with the wind, lengthening the shadows. Everyone was silent, as if the joy of victory did not dispel the haze, and they all kept their mouths shut and said nothing. Because the temperature on the island dropped a little at night, Viserys put on a black cloak. The boy's long silver gold hair hung on the soft cloak, swaying slightly in the wind, and his right hand was tightly holding Rhaenys' hand. Sir William. At this time, Viserys was silent for a long time. It was the first time he opened his lips since getting off the ship. He seemed to have a premonition of something, but he didn't ask it out. Now that he had come to this point, he finally couldn't help it, and turned his head to look at the coach walking beside him. Mother, Queen Leela did not come to the port, and Viserys had guessed something. After all, this was a destined fate. He had tried hard to change, to cure his mother's heart disease, to untie her knot, and even to make her laugh, and make her happier. However, things are unpredictable. Many things did not appear in Viserys' memory, but appeared in this reality. Queen Leela was stimulated, and hid one after another, including the death of the old Maester, the assassination later, and so on. The master's face was slightly gloomy. He heard Viserys' words, then shook his head silently, without saying anything, but Viserys had understood everything. His heart was hit hard, and fell to the bottom of the valley in an instant. He had known it for a long time, he had guessed it for a long time. But when the matter really came to him, it still made his emotions seriously shocked. Viserys stepped on the next stone step, and then stopped abruptly halfway up the mountain. He held Rhaenys with one hand, but his palm trembled slightly unconsciously. His thin body was like he had caught a cold and wanted to cough violently. He bent down and covered his mouth with the other hand. Cough. He tried hard to control his tears from falling under the shadow of the torch. He didn't want Rhaenys and the people around him to see him crying. But in the end it was useless. Chapter 45 Burial. Under the deep night, Viserys stood quietly on the hillside. Hula, the black plush cloak fluttered in the wind, and the slightly curly hair swept across the lavender eyes. This is the sunny side of the active volcano on Dragonstone Island. The temperature on Dragonstone Island is also very high. Queen Leela's body cannot be preserved, so she did not wait for Viserys to return. As the acting Lord of Dragonstone Island, the steward appointed by Prince Rhaegar, the Duke of Dragonstone, the illegitimate son from Dawn, led the people on the island to hold a funeral for Queen Leela. The queen who had a rough and changeable life was buried here. Mother's nature is cheerful and lively. She should be accompanied by sunshine, breeze and white clouds. Viserys stood in the front and spoke abruptly. The voice was carried far away by the wind. But white smoke billowed above Queen Leela's tombstone. Blood and fire come from the same source as the motto of the Targaryen family. It is not surprising that Queen Leela, as a Targaryen, would choose to live next to fire after her death, so Viserys had no objection to the place where his mother was buried. Viserys stood at the front, and there were many guards around him. Sershad, the acting Lord of Dragonstone, stood behind him. He had a yellow turban on his head and some fine wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. Then he squinted his eyes slightly, and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes became deeper. Sershad looked at Viserys' back, a little absent-minded. The coach standing next to him noticed this keenly, frowned slightly, and looked at the other person deeply. He opened his mouth, as if he wanted to say something, but in the end he didn't say it. Then he retracted his gaze, and looked at Queen Leela's tombstone again. Viserys didn't say much in front of the tombstone, just sat quietly for a while, and then stood up. He was even calmer than when he heard the news just now. There was no excitement, only the sadness hidden in his heart. "Let's go," the silver-haired boy said calmly, and tilted his head slightly. Under the light of the torch, half of Viserys' handsome face was illuminated by the fire, while the other half was immersed in the darkness and could not be seen clearly. Only a pair of eyes were particularly bright. "Yes, Your Majesty," the guards hurriedly agreed after hearing Viserys' words. "And their address changed from Your Highness to Your Majesty at some point." But Viserys didn't care about it at all. It was no different whether he was a prince or a king. If he had a title but no power, he didn't care about a false name. In fact, if he could, he would rather take off these titles and become an ordinary person, but royalty did not allow him to do so. Even if he gave up the title of king, as long as he was still a Targaryen and the hot blood of the Dragon Kings flowed in his body, the Baratheon family would never let him go. Viserys could not escape, and escaping would not even bring him a decent death. So he could only fight bravely with the other party, using swords, fists, and even teeth to bite, and he had to continue to fight for a chance to survive and a place to stand. Viserys. At this time, the coach who had been standing behind him without saying a word suddenly spoke. There is something. William Derry suddenly spoke, even forgetting that he should call Viserys his majesty now. For some reason, the acting Lord of Dragonstone rolled his throat slightly, as if he swallowed a mouthful of saliva, and then stretched his palm to the waist. Among the guards holding torches, several people exchanged glances silently, and seemed to see the tension in each other's eyes. Viserys heard the coach's voice, and turned his head slightly, to look at the other party. The silver gold long hair was slightly curled and wrapped around his forehead, and was blown away by the wind. Then, looking at the other party's hesitation, he raised his hand, to interrupt the coach's next words. "I know what you said, sir." Viserys interrupted the coach. "I'm tired now. We can talk about it tomorrow." The coach was about to say something, but was blocked by Viserys. He choked a little, but the master and apprentice looked at each other, and he saw a different color in the boy's lavender eyes. Viserys said he knew? But how did he know it, when he just came back? Really? The middle-aged coach frowned slightly, but after thinking it over again and again, he finally decided not to continue. He just looked at Viserys and he believed in Viserys' own judgment. On the other side, several guards and Ser Shad breathed a sigh of relief, and their hearts, that had just been hanging, were finally put down. They didn't know what the former Red Castle coach wanted to say to Viserys, whether this person had discovered their plan, but now was not a good time to launch the plan. In the small-scale battle, William Derry's swordsmanship was the biggest obstacle to their plan this time. The brilliance of this Red Keep coach was overshadowed by his elder brother who was a member of the King's Guard, but William Derry's swordsmanship should never be underestimated. His elder brother, John Derry, the former King's Guard of Varys II, might not be able to get any advantage from him. And such a knight who can fight on horseback and on foot, even if his old injuries always relapse, and he is a little weak and sick, is not something they can deal with. What's more, there are more people on the other side now. Then, a group of people with different intentions walked down the active volcano and returned to Dragonstone. Viserys was already a little tired. He didn't sleep all day on the boat until now in the middle of the night. But the silver-haired boy still insisted on taking a look at his sister, Daenerys Targaryen, who was being taken care of by a nanny, who was found from nowhere. The girl who will be famous in the future. Viserys came to the nurse's room. This was a woman who was born and raised on Dragonstone. She had just given birth to a child not long ago. Now that she had milk, she was called by the guards of Dragonstone to feed Princess Daenerys. The silver-haired boy stood in front of the small crib, forcing his tired spirit to look seriously at the little baby girl lying in the soft swaddling clothes. A touch of short, light silver hair, a wrinkled and unlovely little face, and a pair of bright big eyes. The two looked at each other. She saw Viserys, and then she giggled for some reason, babbling and reaching out her hand to grab the little adult in front of her. When Viserys saw Daenerys smile, the tiredness on his face was relieved a lot. He raised his hand slightly and held his sister's hand. Chapter 46 Traitor. Viserys held Daenerys' hand, and the closeness of blood suddenly surged up. This blood is thicker than water. The wrinkled face of the baby girl in the swaddling clothes also showed a happy smile, giggling non-stop. Although she could not understand who the boy in front of her was, the closeness contained in the blood told Daenerys that this person would be one of the closest people in her life. Viserys stood in front of the crib and teased his sister a few times, then yawned slightly. Because of the long journey, he was already exhausted, and then he stopped teasing Daenerys, slightly restrained his smile, and stood up straight. Standing by the crib, a little at a loss, was a young woman with some freckles on her face and a bulging chest, which showed that she had plenty of milk. She was the wet nurse found by the guards to raise Daenerys. However, the nurse was a little flustered at the moment. This was the first big man she had seen since she came to the castle. The acting city lord and the knight in armor, who had seemed so high and mighty, stood obediently behind the boy. Viserys looked at the nurse who raised his sister at the moment. With a little scrutiny in his lavender eyes, he looked her up and down. With Viserys' mental power breaking through 20, his eyes seemed to have a kind of oppression. When looking at him, people would always retreat inexplicably. The nurse, with a good figure, rolled her throat slightly. She had never thought that one day she would be scared away by the eyes of a little boy. The room was quiet and silent for a while. Then the boy's pleasant voice before the voice change period sounded like a clear spring. Reward. Viserys reached into his arms, trying to take out a few silver deer, to reward the other party as an encouragement, to thank the nurse for taking care of his child, while sharing half of her milk with Daenerys. However, what embarrassed Viserys was that he felt around and patted his pockets. He clearly remembered that there should be a few silver deer in his pocket. He played with them for a while before going to bed in the cabin last night. Could it be that he fell asleep because he was too sleepy at that time and dropped them under the bed? This was too bad. He actually dropped the money on the cabin. Viserys secretly decided to find the money back tomorrow. However, what was more important at the moment was how to ease the embarrassing situation. With Viserys' crisp voice, several people in the room shuddered slightly. No one thought that Viserys would spend a lot of money. However, Viserys fumbled in his pockets, but he never took out anything. Everyone's eyes suddenly changed slightly. Several people in the room looked at each other, and the atmosphere was very awkward for a while. Viserys' little face was still tense and looked unchanged, surprisingly calm. However, while he continued to fumble in his empty pockets meaninglessly, he racked his brains on the other side, thinking about how to ease this embarrassing situation. "Your Majesty, I think your wallet is here." At this time, Sir William, who was standing behind Viserys, could no longer bear to watch. He was very familiar with his disciple, and he was the first to realize that Viserys must have no money in his pocket. Then the coach took out a gold dragon from his arms and handed it to the other party. Viserys breathed a sigh of relief and gave the coach a thank you look. Then he coughed lightly, rubbed the carving on the surface of the golden dragon with his fingers, and resisted the reluctance in his heart, and rewarded the nanny with this golden coin. The nanny was naturally flattered. You know, the value of a gold dragon is even enough to buy her and send her to work in Shatteir's cottage in King's Landing. After rewarding the nanny, Viserys turned his head and looked at the people behind him, and then suddenly spoke. "Sir William, that happened before. I'm a little worried about Daenerys' safety," Viserys said. The previous incident he mentioned was the incident that happened a few months ago when the mercenaries from the other side of the Narrow Sea secretly sneaked into Dragonstone to launch an assassination. "Why don't you stay here tonight?" Daenerys and her nurse lived in the room that used to be Queen Rhaella's. There were many rooms here, enough to vacate one for Sir William, and Viserys was still in his old bedroom. He hoped that the coach could protect his sister's safety. The middle-aged coach with slightly curly hair was slightly stunned when he heard the little king's words, but he nodded after a hesitation. Okay. He didn't know why Viserys suddenly made such a decision, but he always felt that it might not be as simple as the surface. Then, it was late at night. After visiting his sister, Viserys finally returned to his bedroom to rest. The whole castle fell into silence, as if everyone had fallen asleep. However, in the distance, in the direction of the port of Dragonstone, Sir Jaffrey put on his armor, took the long sword from the soldier, and put it on his waist. Some of the strong and elite soldiers on the fleet followed the old knight, and then the group did not ride on horses, but walked to the direction of Dragonstone Castle, and extinguished all the torches. Led by the old knight, dozens of soldiers rushed over silently in the night. In the castle, Viserys returned to the bedroom, without taking off his leather armor, but just closed the quilt, blew out the candle with a whoosh, and then fell asleep. I don't know how long it has been. The bell of the temple sounded in the distance. A hint of fish belly white has appeared on the horizon. It is approaching dawn, which is the time when people are most sleepy and tired. The guard who had been on duty all night yawned slightly, but at this moment, a figure rushed out of the darkness, holding a dagger in one hand to cover the other's mouth, and the other hand fiercely stabbed into the guard's throat. Puff, the sharp dagger penetrated without any hindrance. The The guard opened his eyes wide with fear, looking at the person who killed him with disbelief. He did not expect that this person would suddenly kill him. However, before his brain could understand what happened, his eyes went black and the body fell to the ground. The acting Lord of Dragonston, the bastard from Dawn, gently wiped the blood splattered on his face. His face looked a little hideous. Behind him were several Targaryen guards. With the great victory of the fleet in Shipbreaker Bay, they realized that they could not drag it on any longer, otherwise they would be exposed sooner or later. Now their sense of crisis is getting worse and worse. Finally, at this moment before dawn, they made up their minds to launch this plan. Follow me. Kill the bastard of the evil dragon. Chapter 47 Clues. It was late at night and everyone was asleep. Viserys was sleeping on his side on the soft big bed in his bedroom. His long silver gold hair spread on the pillow. The boy had enviable delicate skin, his handsome cheeks were white and rosy, and his lips were gently pursed. At this moment, suddenly, some strange noises came from the castle. It seemed that there were faint shouts, and then it turned into the sound of fighting, accompanied by screams. Now, the sky was faintly white. Dawn had arrived. Viserys had just closed his eyes and had not slept for a few hours when he was awakened by the chaotic and noisy sound. The boy's long eyelashes trembled slightly, and then he slowly opened his pair of lavender eyes like gems. Damn it. Viserys turned over and sat up from the bed, lifted the soft quilt, and his long silver gold hair fell on his shoulders. At first, there was some confusion and impatience in his eyes, but he finally shook his head to dispel the irrelevant element in his brain. He also heard the noise outside, the sound of weapons colliding, and the shouts of killing approaching, and he understood what was happening in an instant. As it started, Viserys' last bit of sleepiness was dispelled, and he woke up in an instant. In fact, Viserys had already grasped some information about Ser Shad's rebellion. The reason was naturally that he had discovered some clues a long time ago. The death of Maester Daniel was full of doubts, and it seemed that he was poisoned. Before he died, the old Maester also took Viserys' hand and whispered a few words in his ear, telling him that there were people with ulterior motives in the castle, and asked Viserys to be more careful. The old Maester had a long life, at least in this era, and he had walked a lot of roads and met many people in his life. After personally teaching Viserys for several months, he came to a conclusion that he had never mentioned to anyone. This conclusion had been buried in the old Maester's heart until he walked into the coffin. Perhaps it sounds a little unbelievable. That is, he thought Prince Viserys was better than Prince Rhaegar. This may sound different from what many people think, but the old Maester still insists on his own judgment. He once taught Rhaegar himself, and he also taught Viserys later. He even spent much more time with Rhaegar than with the second prince. Prince Rhaegar is indeed wise, there is nothing wrong with that, but the prince's wisdom is still limited to a certain framework, perhaps this era, or perhaps this world. The old Maester did not think there was anything wrong with this, because Rhaegar's intelligence also amazed him. However, since Maester Daniel came into contact with Viserys and had an in-depth conversation with the child, the old Maester was astonished to find that Viserys always inadvertently mentioned some ideas that transcended this era and even this world in his words. Some of these ideas are shocking, some are impractical, and some are extraordinary. Maester Daniel thinks he has read a lot of books, from the heroic age 8,000 years ago to many miscellaneous books today. However, Viserys' ideas have never been limited to this framework, and perhaps this is why he is even more great. This is why the old Maester took Viserys' hand before his death, let him lie on his mouth, and told him about this, instead of Queen Rhaegar. Because the old Maester believed that Viserys would do better than his mother. And Viserys has never lived up to the old Maester's expectations before his death. He has not told anyone, since he knew about this, even his mother. Of course, he was not worried that his mother would leak the secret, but his mother's mental state was very bad at that time. She often got angry or cried for no reason. Viserys didn't want these things to disturb Queen Rhaegar's rest, so he had been silently planning alone. However, hard work pays off. After the old Maester died, Viserys discovered that the raven cage responsible for external communications on Dragonston had been moved. Someone seemed to have used ravens to pass on some news to the outside world after getting rid of the old Maester. but the other party's actions have been very careful, and Viserys has not found any clues, so he has been unable to determine the other party's identity. Is it one person or a group of people? However, before Viserys followed the fleet to the expedition this time, he deliberately told Sir William about this matter. As Viserys' swordsmanship teacher, the coach once risked his life to save Queen Rhaella and Viserys and her son. If it weren't for him, Viserys would have died long ago, so Sir William naturally had no doubt and was trustworthy. Viserys hoped that the coach could help pay attention to who would be eager to expose themselves after he left. This was also the reason why Sir William hesitated to speak several times in front of Viserys. However, Viserys did not let him say it, because the boy had obtained information through other channels before returning to Dragonstone and understood who the traitor hiding on the island was. During the fleet's return, a small boat was intercepted in the marginal waters near Dragonstone. The other party saw the fleet coming fiercely and hurriedly wanted to speed up and leave. However, it was chased by the experienced sailors in the fleet in a small boat and finally blocked it. Several people on the boat even wanted to jump off the boat and commit suicide, but only one person was drowned, and the rest were fished out. After severe interrogation, these people finally confessed their identities. These people all came from King's Landing. The acting Lord of Dragonstone, Ser Shad, had already secretly surrendered to the Baratheon family. King Robert on the Iron Throne even promised him a castle and the title of Earl. However, because there was a fleet stationed on Dragonstone, they had no way to hand over Queen Rhaella and her son directly, so they had been waiting for an opportunity. Then they waited for the opportunity when the storm surge came. They knew that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They wanted to take advantage of the fleet being hit by the storm or the opportunity to leave the port, to kill Queen Rhaella and Viserys and escape from here. But things happened to take a turn again. Viserys actually left with the fleet of Dragonstone, and they didn't know where the fleet was going. Sir Geoffrey had a hot temper and was stubborn, and he didn't take him, the acting lord, seriously at all. Chapter 48, Rebellion. However, Viserys is a boy of the Targaryen family. His life is actually much more important than Queen Rhaella, including the child in Queen Rhaella's belly, before the gender is determined. None of them are more important than Viserys' head. If they went to great lengths and took huge risks to launch the plan, but only killed Queen Rhaella, but left Viserys, then their plan this time is equivalent to a complete failure, and the Iron Throne will not fulfill his promise. Because the heir of Targaryen has not died yet. So in desperation, the bastard from Dorne and the guards he bribed had to continue to wait patiently for Viserys to come back. Then they waited for the news of the great victory of the Battle of Shipbreaker Bay. The Targaryen fleet destroyed the navy of the Baratheon family in one battle and returned victorious. In fact, Ser Shad had been forced into a corner by Viserys, and he even had no chance of continuing to hide. Because as the master of the castle, he could already sense the undercurrents in Dragonstone. Perhaps someone had noticed their actions and was secretly investigating something and was about to track him down. He had secretly killed all the chefs he had bribed before and silenced them. But this was not enough. Ser Shad's inner panic grew with the news of the fleet's victory. He was afraid that he would die a miserable death if what he had done was exposed. So, with all his might, he took the initiative to contact the spy from King's Landing and told him that he would launch a plan to kill Viserys and the newborn Targaryen baby girl on the first night after Viserys returned to Dragonstone. Then he asked the other party to send a small boat to help them evacuate. The bastard had no choice but to no longer care about the return of the Targaryen fleet. His inner sense of urgency told him that if he didn't launch the plan, they might not be able to do anything and would be directly caught and skinned. If he gave up the plan and ran away overnight, not only would the castle and Earl fly away, but the Baratheon family might not let him go, and he would have to live in exile on the continent of Essos for the rest of his life. So after weighing the pros and cons, Ser Shad could only grit his teeth and make a desperate decision. But unfortunately, the bastard didn't know that the King's Landing's pickup personnel had not yet arrived at Dragonstone, and they just ran into the returning Targaryen fleet. They couldn't even abandon the ship and jump into the sea and were directly caught in one net, and he also gave him up. So Viserys actually knew that Ser Shad was the traitor on Dragonstone before getting off the ship. but Viserys did not directly order the guards on the left and right to kill this person after getting off the ship, because he was sure that, since the other party wanted to launch a plan to kill him, there would definitely be more than one person. So he wanted to take this opportunity to fish all these people out and catch them all in one net. Otherwise, if this opportunity was not fully utilized to eradicate them, these people would hide and stay on the island from beginning to end, and they would still be hidden dangers. This was Viserys' plan. He had already discussed with the old knight, who was also aware of the situation. Sir Geoffrey would lead some of the elite in the fleet and his own guards to set off to Dragonstone in the middle of the night without alerting the enemy. There were naturally people arranged in Dragonstone to open the gate for them. And now, Viserys sat up from the soft bed, listening to the shouting and killing outside. The guards in Dragonstone were alarmed and rushed out in a hurry. They didn't know who the attackers were and thought it was the same as a few months ago, with mercenaries from the other side of the narrow sea sneaking into the castle and launching a surprise attack. However, they didn't expect that it was their former brothers who suddenly killed them. For a while, many guards in the castle were killed and injured. A large part of the guards in Dragonstone were soldiers who had followed Rhaegar Targaryen, and most of them were loyal to Targaryen. However, a small number of them had been bribed by Ser Shad. After being attacked by their brothers who launched a rebellion, the guards in Dragonstone quickly reacted to who the enemy was, and then accused the other party of betrayal with anger, and then drew their swords to fight back. The two sides soon fought in various places in the castle. But now Viserys was sitting on the bed, but was unexpectedly calm. Although it has only been less than a year since he came to this world, the things that the boy has experienced are already exciting that he has never experienced in his previous and present lives. Raids, assassinations, wars. The blood in Viserys' body is still boiling, but he no longer has the initial panic and tension. In fact, there is a saying that has been circulating in Westeros. A recruit transforms into a veteran by surviving a war and killing a person. The silver-haired boy has experienced all of this, so when he faces it again, at least he will not appear so helpless. Viserys sat on the bed and calmly tidied up the leather armor that he had not taken off. The dagger was also beside the bed, but there was also a big killer in his bedroom. That was the crossbow left by the mercenary who came to assassinate him. Viserys felt that at this stage, this weapon was most useful to him. Facing an enemy that might threaten him, a boy holding a sword and a boy holding a string crossbow and aiming at each other are more deterrent. At this time, Viserys' door was knocked. "Your Majesty." The guards outside the door reminded him they were afraid that the little king had not woken up yet. The two fully armed soldiers were two elite soldiers temporarily transferred from the fleet, and they replaced Viserys' original guards. These two people have followed the old knight for many years, and their loyalty is naturally beyond doubt, so Viserys can sleep so peacefully. At this time, Viserys also opened the door and walked out of the bedroom. Although Viserys was not very afraid of Ser Shad's rebellion, he felt that the other party could not stir up any waves. However, it was still the same. Viserys' life no longer represented not only his own, but also many people who were still loyal to Targaryen. So according to the plan, Viserys would be escorted out of his bedroom, because this must be the first target of the rebels. The two of them would escort the little king to the table hall, and the elite navy who came from outside the castle would rush directly to the table hall on the top floor, after entering the castle. First protecting Viserys' safety, and then extinguishing the rebellion in the castle one by one. Let's go. Under the flames in the corridor, Viserys had a calm face, slightly adjusted his collar, and held the crossbow in his hand, and then spoke calmly. "Yes, Your Majesty." The two soldiers responded in a deep voice, and then they protected Viserys in the middle, and ran straight to the top floor of the castle. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 49 Blood and Fire. There were shouts and cries of killing outside. The sound of steady footsteps in the corridor was clear. The flames on the dragon claw torch stands along the way were dancing. Viserys walked in the middle, listening to the noise outside that was getting closer and closer, and his heart couldn't help but feel a little cold. It turned out that he was not as calm as he seemed. He originally thought that this rebellion was just a little fuss by Sir Sand and a few soldiers, and it could be easily suppressed without any effort. However, Viserys didn't expect that it would affect such a large area. It seemed that there were more soldiers in Dragonstone who had rebelled than he thought. It turned out that he and his mother had been living in danger before. I don't know how many eyes that looked at them from behind contained deep malice. Those people hiding around them wanted to kill them and their son to collect the bounty. Even now, when Viserys thought of these, he would even feel a little cold all over his body, and his heartbeat would once again accelerate. Yes, the Targaryen dynasty is over, and now Baratheon is the one sitting on the Iron Throne. How can he guarantee that these guards will remain loyal to the Targaryen dynasty without the slightest wavering? Thinking of this, Viserys' hand holding the crossbow tightened a little, but fortunately, this time it would stop here. All these hidden traitors will be fished out, and then completely caught in one fell swoop. The silver-haired boy exhaled a breath of turbid air, and then he found that some cold sweat had seeped out of the palm of his hand holding the crossbow. Of course, he was not as calm as he pretended to be. He was also afraid of accidents, afraid of death, but it was much better than the appearance that he couldn't even pretend at the beginning. The two guards in front and behind protected Viserys through the corridor of the stone drum tower. Along the stone stairs, he climbed to the highest floor of the main castle, the table hall with the map of the entire Westeros continent. Your Majesty, Your Majesty. The two guards guarding the door of the table hall saw Viserys. They were fully armored, and then they clenched their fists and saluted slightly. Viserys didn't say much, but just nodded to the two guards who were still loyal to Targaryen. Then the two guards guarding the gate pushed open the heavy brown wooden door of the drawing table hall for Viserys. Creaky. Two soldiers from the fleet entered the drawing table hall with Viserys. Click. Then the bolt was inserted from the inside of the door, and the cabinet was overturned and supported with heavy objects to prevent accidental betrayers from entering the drawing table hall. After entering the drawing table hall, Viserys went directly to the main seat in the middle, which was once the seat of his mother Queen Rhaella. And even longer ago, it was Aegon the Conqueror and his two sisters Visenya and Rhaenys who sat here, and the three-headed dragon looked down at the entire Westeros continent ambitiously. Now, the person sitting in this position has changed to Viserys. He, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. A long list of titles, and the last one is Viserys Targaryen III. The silver-haired boy sat on this heavy chair, but he didn't feel cold and hard, because the previous owner of this chair, Queen Rhaella, was pregnant. She naturally couldn't sit in a cold position, so this heavy chair has been covered with luxurious and soft animal fur. Viserys put his hands on the armrests of the main seat, overlooking the huge map table below, which was carved with a detailed map of Westeros. The entire map table was more than 50 feet long. The widest part was about half of the length, and the narrowest part was less than 4 feet. The main seat, where Viserys was sitting now, was exactly the location of Dragonstone Island on the map. Nearly 300 years ago, the designers carefully considered and designed it, and finally ensured that the position of this main seat could overlook the entire Westeros continent. King's Landing, Harrenhal, Storm's End, Eyrie, Casterly Rock. Viserys' eyes started from Dragonstone and kept jumping to the major cities on the continent of Westeros. He had read the history of Aegon I's conquest wars at the request of the old Maester. These were exactly the routes that Aegon I took to conquer Westeros. In the Battle of the Blackwater, 3 dragons were thrown into the war at the same time. The dragon flames spewed by the dragons burned the grassland, the fire frightened the horses, and the thick smoke made it impossible for the soldiers to see the enemy in front of them. This battle directly led to the defeat of the coalition forces of nearly 55,000 people, including the King of Casterly Rock, Loren Lannister, and the King of the Reach, Mongardner IX. While Viserys was immersed in history, he even had a faint hallucination in front of his eyes, as if he had witnessed this great war with his own eyes. The noisy sound outside the drawing table woke him up. Kill the bastard of the dragon. Kill the son of the Mad King. The brown wooden door of the Tuzu hall was being blocked by overturned cabinets and heavy objects, but the shouts and screams outside the door seemed to be close at hand. Clang clang clang. Everywhere there were the sounds of weapons colliding, shouts of killing, the sound of swords cutting into flesh, and the screams of injured soldiers. It seemed that the last two guards guarding outside the Tuzu hall had already started fighting with the rebels. Bang. Then there was the sound of a heavy object hitting the door, as if a soldier had hit the door during the fight. The heavy brown wooden door trembled slightly, but fortunately it was not directly knocked open, because of the heavy object blocking the door. Viserys suddenly woke up. Silver gold hair hung on the boy's fair cheeks. One of his elbows was still on the armrest of the main seat, and his palm supported his cheek. Then he raised his head slightly. He was awakened by the shouts and screams outside. His face turned slightly pale, and the panic that could no longer be concealed finally appeared in his lavender eyes that had been calm before. The boy closed his eyes slightly, took a deep breath, and then opened them again. The enemy has reached the door. Everyone. Viserys sat on the chair without standing up, but slightly straightened his thin body. He wanted to say something to boost morale. Now Viserys was sitting here, which was actually a dead end. Behind the main seat of the picture table hall was a huge rooftop where he could see the entire sea. It was dozens of yards above the ground. If he jumped down, he would definitely die. There was still a little panic in the boy's voice, which was forced to be calm. But he still held the crossbow in his hand tightly and aimed it at the main door. If the enemy really rushed in, he guaranteed that the first person to come in would also die. Defend your majesty to the death. However, two loyal Targaryen fleet soldiers drew their swords and slapped their shields, standing on both sides of the throne. The traitor swore that he would have to step over his own dead body before he could harm the little king. Chapter 50. Suppressing the rebellion. The bravery of the two guards boosted Viserys' morale. The silver-haired boy still sat on the main seat without moving, slightly tightening the crossbow in his hand. Bang. At this moment, the door of the Tuzu hall once again made a loud noise, and there was also the sound of metal armor, as if someone was hitting the door. Viserys' heart tightened slightly, and cold sweat oozed out of his palms, but his eyes still did not waver at all, staring at the direction of the door. The silver-haired boy could clearly hear the breathing of the two young soldiers around him was also slightly heavy. It can be seen that they were also very nervous. They were not afraid of death, but they still did not retreat. The fighting outside the brown wooden door continued. Puff, the sound of a long sword cutting a throat, accompanied by a shrill scream. Crash, the tables and chairs were pushed over, and the torches were thrown to the ground, and the flames burned fiercely. The battle outside was extremely fierce, and the three people hiding in the Tuzu hall were like prisoners waiting for the judgment of fate, and they didn't know what the result would be when the door was opened. Life or death. The atmosphere in the drawing room was so tense that it froze a little. Even breathing became cautious, and cold sweat kept falling from the forehead. Every minute and every second of waiting for the trial seemed like a torture. However, I don't know how long it has passed. Bang, the brown wooden door was hit again, and made a loud noise. Viserys woke up slightly. It turned out that he didn't know why he was a little absent-minded just now. Since he came to Dragonstone, he often had this problem. He was inexplicably dazed and seemed to see some illusions, just like when he was staring at the map just now. And this situation seemed to be getting more and more obvious. However, after being awakened this time, Viserys found that the shouting and killing outside had stopped. Everything suddenly became quiet, except for the sound of collisions. It seemed that nothing else had happened. Is the battle over? Viserys sat up slightly, staring at the direction of the door with full concentration, holding the crossbow in his hand tightly. The cabinet that was pushed down behind the door of the drawing room had also been knocked open a little. The gate was about to be breached. The next second, boom, several fully armed knights, holding blood-stained long swords in their hands, directly used their heavy shoulders to violently knock open the door of the Tuzu hall. Wood chips flew. The heavy brown wooden door was torn into pieces, and the outside of the door was like a wanton splash of paint, smeared with blood everywhere. Just looking at it would make people's brains congested, and their faces pale. The smell in the air was so disgusting that it made people want to vomit directly. And the crossbow in Viserys' hand was also activated at this time. Bang! The crisp sound of the bowstring broke the silence of a second after the gate was knocked open. The bowstring of the crossbow burst out with power, and the crossbow arrow that had been stuck on it flew out. Then, in the horrified eyes of the knight who rushed into the tussle hall at the front, it was nailed hard on the black stone wall above the gate. Bang! The broken stones flew, and along with the dust, they fell on the armor of the two knights below, making a rustling sound. The two knights were frightened, and also looked a little humiliated. "Your Majesty." At this time, behind the two knights who rushed in first, an old man in shiny armor and a red cloak embroidered with three-headed Targaryen dragons strode in with a blood gourd in one hand. The old man's footsteps were heavy, and he remained calm when facing Viserys' crossbow. "Calm down." The man was the commander of the Dragonstone fleet, Sir Geoffrey, and the thing he was holding in his hand, which looked like a blood gourd, was actually a person. The blood dragged on the ground along the way was like a free money, and it went directly from the gates to the center of the map table hall, and then fell in front of the giant map table. Plop! The captive covered in blood fell to the ground, but didn't make a sound, like a pool of rotten meat. If it weren't for his chest still rising and falling, and the continuous gasping sound, perhaps he would have thought that this person was dead. "Sorry, sir." Viserys sat on the main seat awkwardly, then stood up from his seat with his hands on the armrests, and apologized to the old sergeant and the two knights who first broke through the gate and rushed in. He was a little too nervous just now, so when they just rushed in, he directly pulled the bowstring under the stress reaction. However, Viserys compensated quickly, and slightly raised the direction of aiming before the crossbow arrow was fired, and the crossbow arrow was directly nailed on the wall above the gate. Fortunately, no big mistake was made. Then Viserys looked at the bloody man carried in by Sir Geoffrey. Although the other party was already bloody and his identity was almost unrecognizable, Viserys still recognized who this person was at a glance. He was the acting lord and steward of the castle appointed by Rhaegar before he left Dragonstone, the illegitimate son from Dorne, Sir David Sand, and also the culprit of this rebellion. He had been bribed by King's Landing long before, and promised to gain high rank, and tempted Sir Shad with the title of Earl and a castle, to betray the Targaryen family, and kill the orphans and widows who fled to Dragonstone. But Sir Shad was afraid that, even if the plan succeeded in killing Queen Rhaenyra and her son, they would not be able to escape the pursuit of the Dragonstone fleet, so he did not dare to act, and missed good opportunities again and again. Until the storm was coming, Viserys left Dragonstone with the fleet, missing the best opportunity. Now the last dying struggle was suppressed by Viserys, who had been prepared in advance. All the guards, servants, and rats from King's Landing that he bribed on Dragonstone died in this rebellion, which was a real loss. "Do you want to interrogate him in person, Your Majesty?" The two knights who rushed in first stroked their chests slightly, not daring to accept Viserys' apology. The old knight simply ignored all this, stood in front of the map table, looked at the small figure standing next to the main seat, and spoke directly. "Interrogate him in person?" Viserys hesitated slightly when he heard the old lord's words. The curly hair wrapped around the boy's ears, making him look very cute. Then he shook his head. "No, Lord Geoffrey." Viserys stood beside the main seat, then slightly turned sideways, and wanted to sit back in the chair. He was not very interested in continuing to watch a bloody person. However, Viserys seemed to have thought of something. He stopped abruptly, turned his head, and looked at Sir Geoffrey, who was standing in front of the map table, and then spoke. "I want to know what he has done. I'll leave it to you." Then Viserys added, "It's better to leave his life and let me kill him personally." End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.